Don Lester and David Parker are the authors of the book What Really Makes You Ill. And it's an amazing book. It's about 800 pages long. I think it has dozens and dozens of pages of footnotes. It's an extraordinary history of medical science. And I was really excited to have the chance to interview them. And here they are. Um, Tell us briefly, maybe about when you started writing the book, and maybe if we could go historically and what you found, starting with Pasteur and working your way up from there. Sort of how you got to that, and then working your way up from there, just so that you don't have to repeat yourself.
Okay, well, because of, as I said, we started to realize there were big problems with the what we were being told uh, uh, about the medical system and about illness. And because of sad experiences that I'd had with family and friends dying of cancer before I knew anything about this, despite the medical establishment saying they were having greater success, but they never had any success with any of the close family and friends that I had because they all died. Apart from one lady who refused to have anything to do with the medical establishment, and her cancer disappeared and she lived a happy and long life. So that was a starter to a wake-up call. And then when we started researching another book, which was about the nature of reality under our pen name NOR, we realized we needed to know something a bit more about viruses. And that's when we first started our deep dive into looking at the medical side of things. And purely by chance, the first sort of disease we happened to look at was HIV/AIDS. And we started to realize there was lots of anomalies, and we started to realize that all the things that we'd been told by the media at the time, and we're going back to the 80s now, when it sort of first reared its head on the world, and the media was ramping it up as to, millions were going to die worldwide. And it didn't matter whether you were heterosexual or homosexual, it was going to spread into the entire population. And it was a real doomsday prophecy, I think we've heard a similar story, haven't we, today with COVID, a lot of parallels as we looking back at what we were finding out about HIV/AIDS, we're seeing it all again. So we've seen all this before. And the media were, again, with the chief culprits and the medical establishment, again, telling packs of lies. Again, without boring you too much, we obviously looked and spent a lot of time researching HIV/AIDS to find out what the truth was. We spoke to lots of doctors. We spoke to HIV positive patients. And we soon realized that this small group of men in the San Francisco area in America, who were supposed to be the first people to be exhibiting these symptoms, it was nothing to do with the virus at all. It was quite easy to find out that it was their use of recreational drugs. In most cases, it was what we call poppers, which is amyl nitrate, a very toxic drug, but gives great highs, apparently. I've never tried it, nor do I wish to. But that was very rife amongst that small community in San Francisco. Well, of course, being amyl nitrate being very toxic, started to make them ill, of course. And then they were going to their doctors and getting high doses of antibiotics, which is also toxic. I know people think antibiotics is a wonder drug, but we discuss that in the book to show just how toxic it is and how it works on the body. So they were getting a combination of toxic amyl nitrate and antibiotics, so in high doses, which just made them even more ill. And sort of any resistance their bodies had to clearing out these toxins was slowly diminished, and so they became even more ill. So the doctors at the time didn't know what to make of this. They saw it as a new disease, as doctors always do, that they didn't understand, and so they just decided at the time they were going to try a drug called AZT or AZT, which was a chemotherapy drug which had fallen out of favor for a while.
There is a reason for them actually introducing this prior sort of cancer drug, is because a lot of researchers who moved into the research of HIV had previously worked in the in cancer research, and mainly with respect to trying to find viral causes of cancer, and they were unsuccessful. For all sorts of reasons, because viruses are, or the particles called viruses, don't cause cancer. So they were, if you like, they sort of transferred from the cancer research into this other new area, because these health problems started to appear in the early 80s. And so they started looking into these health problems and moved across to develop what then became a huge money-earning research field of HIV research. So it's not surprising that one of the drugs that they thought that they would use was an old cancer drug or an old chemotherapy drug. But unlike chemotherapy, which is usually only used for short periods of time, and then the patient is allowed some time off for their body to recover, when AZT was given to these patients, it was given to them, they were to take it constantly, all the time. So
in high dose.
And in high dose, and they weren't, their bodies weren't given any kind of rest period. So it's not surprising that a lot of them,
they all died.
Well, they all, at the beginning, they all succumbed. They all died because the AZT was just so toxic.
And as people may know, we lost good people like Freddie Mercury. Anyone who likes the band Queen would, a great loss, and or Rudolf Nureyev and people like that. So, and they were all died unnecessarily, because they were, well, it falls under the category of iatrogenesis, which is basically death by modern medicine. It's a proper term. In the States alone, there's something like 250,000 people every year die under this category of iatrogenesis, which is dying from the prescriptions given by their physicians. Not that they've overdosed, not that they've been given or used it incorrectly. They've just been given it and it's killed them, like AZT killed these so-called AIDS patients. So that was our first deep dive, and we realised that there was, Dawn and I remember saying to one another, blimey, if they're so wrong about this, what else are they wrong about? And that's really what kicked it off for us, to look even deeper to find out what was going off with the medical establishment. And of course, we came across the work of Kary Mullis, who's been mentioned a lot during this present escapade of coronavirus. Unfortunately, he died in August 2019. Some may say quite suspiciously, but that's another story. But he had said right from the outset, and he got the Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR test. And he said all along that this was not what this test was designed for. It's not a diagnostic test. It's designed just to amplify small bits of genetic material so that you can work with it easier. That's what it was designed to do, not as a diagnostic test to discover viruses.
Because it can't.
Because it can't.
It just doesn't. It just amplifies genetic material.
But nonetheless, they ignored the Nobel Prize winner, Kary Mullis, and carried on doing it anyway. And because it suited their purpose as a money-making scheme. And but of course, unfortunate for them, because the doses of AZT they were using killed everybody, that was obviously not a good PR side of things. So they secretly kept that under rugs, if you like, and reduced the doses of AZT so that it didn't kill people outright. It doesn't make people well, but it takes much longer usually before people die if they're on that. So not a good story, but again, typical of what we found whenever we looked at the causes of disease. So again, we write about this in detail in our book. So I won't go into it much more than that, but to say that the causes of this so-called illness are quite easy to discover with the drug use and antibiotics and all the rest of it. And no virus has ever been proved to be the cause of AIDS, the AIDS syndrome. And we also look, it might be just interesting to mention, because people have asked us, oh, what about AIDS in Africa? You know, how come there was this big supposed rise in AIDS in Africa? So we did look at that, because, you know, it seemed an anomaly. Obviously, it wasn't the San Francisco scene. So we thought there's got to be some other reason. So we did look at that. And again, cutting a very long story short, we looked at where these groupings of supposed AIDS sufferers were. And we found that they all seemed to center around the antenatal clinics in Africa, where obviously pregnant women were going to have their pregnancies monitored and assistance. And we immediately became clear that because of this strange anomaly that the medical establishment decided to do, which was about looking at antibodies, and they decided, which was a complete turnaround from what they normally do, that if you had certain antibodies in your blood, then you were HIV positive. Now, as it turns out, you can have, and I think someone calculated something like 60 different illnesses that will produce these same antibodies in your blood. And you would then, by the establishment, be told that you're HIV positive. And strangely, one of the symptoms that produces these antibodies in your blood is if you're pregnant. And so we soon started to see that why around these antenatal clinics you were getting these large clusters of supposed HIV positive people, because these antibodies naturally were found in the bodies of pregnant women. Nothing to do with HIV, nothing to do with any illness at all. But they were being labelled HIV positive and classed as AIDS patients.
It's the same, as I say, it's just that, you know, like they're doing at the moment, anybody who has a positive test result is regarded as a case. So all the women who were testing positive as a result of going to the antenatal clinics, they were testing positive, and so they were called HIV positive, and they were the cases. And these cases were then extrapolated to the rest of the population. Again, it's, you know, using statistics. And that's how, you know, there was a sudden sort of explosion in HIV apparently in Africa or in AIDS cases. But of course, with the positive test result and the idea that somebody is infected with HIV, which is what the idea is, what this case is, they then are encouraged to go on to the various drugs. Now, obviously, it's pretty serious with a pregnant woman, and the implications and the consequences for the baby are pretty serious, because not just the mother, but the baby is being exposed to pretty toxic drugs. And so, you know, that's, you know, it's pretty tragic that so many people are getting tests for something that doesn't exist, and then they're being given drugs which actually will then cause them to be ill and their babies to be ill,
and possibly die,
and possibly die as well. So again, you know, you can see parallels, but it's purely testing. That's what caused the so-called explosion in Africa. It's all to do with tests.
The same way as it's only testing now with COVID,
yes,
that makes it look like there's lots of cases where there are none at all. I defy anyone, and I mean this, I defy anyone to prove there is one single person anywhere in the world that's got a disease called COVID produced by this virus. I defy anyone to do it. Or any autopsy, any of the people that they say have died from COVID, I challenge them to produce an autopsy report that can prove that that's what they've died of, because no one has.
And how do you know that?
Sorry?
And how do you know that?
Well, we know that from asking doctors. We know a few doctors around the world and looking for any reports, and there aren't any, you know. In fact, talking to, well, I won't name the doctors, but talking to some of the doctors, you'll know who they are, but because they're quite well known on the stage at the moment. And they know from the records that they have access to that in most cases, no autopsies are even done. In fact, the physicians are told not to carry out autopsies. Now, that again in itself is must strike alarm bells for people. Why would you not do that? But they don't. And there are financial incentives, particularly in the States, for being able to put cause of death as a COVID. You know, there are financial incentives to do that for the hospitals, the same as the financial incentives from Medicare, that if people come in and can be diagnosed with COVID, there is a financial incentive. If they get put on a ventilator, there's an even bigger financial incentive. The fact that most people, and I've been given figures of 80%, who get put on, come in with supposed COVID and get put on a ventilator, 80% of them die, because being put on a ventilator is a very intrusive thing. I mean, they're put under general anesthetic, and these to stop their body from fighting against a mechanical breathing apparatus, if you like. So that's why they're under general anesthetic. It's not just, pipe up your nose or something. It's a very intrusive thing. And there's tens of thousands of dollars get given for each case. So again, and then when that person dies and got an incentive to put COVID as the cause of death, you can see how these figures get ramped up, and there's a lot of money being made. And this information is coming to us from doctors in America who know what's going off. So just coming back a bit to the AIDS thing, just to fulfill the picture there, because around these clinics, all of this false testing based on antibodies, which would be in your body for all sorts of reasons and don't prove anything, there was also a financial incentive there. I have African friends. I worked in Africa many years ago, so I still have friends in Africa and over here. Again, there was funding made available to units that were claiming high rates of AIDS cases. So you can see the financial incentive. People could be having anything. It could be malaria, although we can talk about that. They could have anything, but you weren't getting the funding for that. But if you said, we've got this increasing AIDS cases, then there was World Health funding given to those institutions and to those clinics. So there was a big incentive there to claim lots of AIDS cases. So you can see how this thing grew out of all proportion in Africa. But based on no science, based on no actual disease. We don't deny that people died, but people die everywhere, particularly in Africa, from all sorts of things. Nothing to do with some new disease and nothing to do with some viral infection. And in the AIDS cases, if people got put on these very toxic drugs, then that would be what killed them over a period. It might be a year, it might be a couple of years, but that would be what killed them. But of course, the medical establishment can just sign them off, as they did, died of AIDS. And it's like the old joke said, that the mistakes made by doctors, they just bury their mistakes. And of course, that's exactly what happens. And that's the tragedy of it. So that was quite a long talk about AIDS, but it's quite important because we're seeing the same thing now in a different way. We're seeing people being categorized as having a disease which they don't have, based on a virus which doesn't exist and has never been proved to exist. But now they've got the whole thing on steroids, where they're using it worldwide to bring in these draconian measures, again, based on nothing. And as we said earlier, they've been challenged by us, they've been challenged by people all around the world, the government health departments and the governments themselves, under the Freedom of Information Act, to show the scientific evidence for the proof of this supposed deadly virus. And in every case, they've come back and said, we do not have that information. And yet they just continue to do the things that they do. So, but going right back to the germ theory, which we started on, what got us all going on this, is, as we've said, right from the very beginning, when 150 years ago, when Pasteur, who's sort of credited with the formulating the germ theory, I mean, it actually started before him, but he's been credited with it, wrongly so. But there were many doctors at the time, and they're on the record as not believing it for one moment, and they were very critical of Pasteur. They were very critical of the fact that what he was professing, that these germs were causing diseases. So it's never been accepted by thinking professional people, never. But it has been accepted, of course, as a very good and profitable business model, going way back to the early days of the petrochemical companies and the snake oil salesman, who people have heard about, you know, going around basically selling petrochemical substances as a cure-all for all sorts of things. And that's where it all started. And of course, the Rocker family were the first people doing, some of the first people doing that. And of course, the whole thing has grown out of all proportions. And we are in this very sad state that we're in today, where between the Rockefeller families and the Rothschild families subsidizing and encouraging the pharmaceutical business model, which is extremely profitable, all based on killing something, some microorganism, which has never been proved to cause the said illnesses. And that's why we'd like to refer to the illnesses that people have as illnesses rather than diseases, because people, as soon as you use the word disease, they start to think of infection of some sort. You know, that something, as Dawn said earlier, something from outside has attacked the body. And this whole business model of the pharmaceutical companies is based on that. Whereas in truth, none of that has ever been proven. The body has its own system of protections, if you like. Now, I know people have referred to it as an immune system, but we investigated this so-called immune system and found that the body doesn't actually have an immune system in the way that the medical establishment talk about it. It has a maintenance system, which is something very different, which again pulls the rug out from vaccinations, because the whole edifice of vaccination is built on the fact that they can inject something into your arm, which will then induce antibodies, which then float around in your system. And whenever one of these so-called germs, a virus, attacks your body, these antibodies will recognize it and swoop in and kill it. But when you realize that the body doesn't work like that, it makes a complete nonsense of vaccinations. And again, we've looked at the history of vaccinations, and we've looked at all the treatments that have ever been done by vaccinations. And it's not hard to prove that they have never, ever been proved to be either safe or effective. Neither safe nor effective, but they have been proved to cause a lot of harm. And I'm thinking in particular of the polio vaccine, to name one. And we can talk a little bit about the whole polio thing, if you like, how that originated and what it was, and how Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine. We investigated polio, which generally symptoms are, most people think of symptoms of paralysis from polio. Now, again, cutting a long story short, because we spent a lot of time investigating it, but we found that when polio was at its most rife, that it seemed to be seasonal, and seemed to be around the summertime, springs and summertimes. And no one could really say why that would be. And again, cutting a long story short, investigations showed that it was what the crops at that time were being sprayed with, which in particular was either lead-based insecticides. Now, these lead-based and then became DDT, banned now. Well, none of these things are now used for spraying the crops, and I'm talking fruit and vegetables, but both of those things are highly toxic to the human beings, and it was found that those were the actual causes of these symptoms of paralysis. And of course, the reason that it tended to be more in the summertime is because that's when the crops were growing, and that's when they were being sprayed, and that's when people were eating them, not realizing that they're eating these large quantities of toxic materials. And DDT in particular was actually sort of advertised as really beneficial. You know, they used to spray people with it. You could buy wallpaper impregnated with it to kill the flies and mosquitoes. You know, so people were surrounded with this stuff and being slowly poisoned on a daily basis. Now, once this was realized, of course, those things started to change. But Jonas Salk came along, supposedly inventing a vaccine that was going to prevent people from getting polio. But as the records show, his vaccinations actually caused the symptoms of polio. They actually caused paralysis and all the illnesses that went with it. And he's on the record, and this is the inventor, Jonas Salk, of the vaccine, who actually publicly admitted that his vaccine was actually causing the symptoms of polio. And yet I've still come across doctors today hailing the polio vaccine as a wonder for overcoming polio. And this is, you know, this is doctors today. And yet they don't have to look very hard. They could read our book, but they could look at other sources and see that, you know, nothing could be further from the truth. It's there in the scientific evidence that what was the actual cause of these polio symptoms, and that the polio vaccine actually caused them as well. And that's why they had to stop using it. And yet doctors still think it was a wonderful thing.
And what do you think it was in the vaccine that was causing the paralysis?
Well, it's quite, yeah, I mean, different vaccines will have different ingredients, but it's quite common for vaccines to have substances like formaldehyde, aluminium, and mercury. Just to take three examples, all of them are neurotoxins. So they would attack the nervous system and quite likely cause paralysis. But they're not the only substances that could do that. But I mean, they're the most likely ingredients in vaccines. I mean, it was known for a very long time that there are a number of substances that would actually instigate or initiate paralysis, and mercury has long been known to be associated with paralysis, and we've got examples in the book of some of the doctors who were putting out reports in the late 19th century, I believe, showing that people who worked with mercury and with lead as well, but I mean certainly with mercury, who were then developing paralysis, and it was, you know, very closely related to their exposures to mercury. I think mining is one of the main main jobs, you know, where people can be exposed to mercury. So it's even though people saying, oh, you know, mercury in the vaccines don't cause anything, there's a long history of an association between mercury and paralysis. I mean, that's the other thing with the word polio, with the disease called polio. It's believed to be a kind of a certain disease that is associated with certain symptoms. You know, it's very specific, and a diagnosis of polio means something. But if you look, the definition of polio now is just called an infectious disease, and a very, very small percentage of cases are actually have paralysis. There are far fewer now within that diagnosis, shall we say, whereas 100 years ago and even more, cases of paralysis were almost all involved with what's called polio. So again, it's one of their tactics to slightly change the definition of a disease, if you like. You know, certain symptoms apply in certain cases, and then maybe the symptoms sort of slightly change, or other symptoms are brought in, certain others are dropped off. So paralysis hasn't always been associated with polio. But then again, they're now even changing the definition of polio because they think that it's almost been eradicated. But in the same way that polio cases are dropping, we're now seeing reports of huge increases in cases of something that's called AFP, which is acute flaccid paralysis. Also, there's AFM, which is acute I think, no, sorry, there's another one, with myelitis. But again, it's, these are other so-called diagnoses that are believed to be different diseases, but they're not. They're just, I think they're called clinically indistinguishable from polio. So how they can actually distinguish, but these are certainly cases of paralysis that are being now called, as I say, under this different name. And many of them are occurring after the polio vaccine has been given. So that's quite interesting, especially in countries like India, where I think this is quite rife. That the increase in cases of AFP are just phenomenal. As in the same way that they're seeing a sort of a decrease in polio, they're seeing an increase in AFP, and a lot of these cases are occurring after the polio vaccine.
So this is the trick, as Dawn has said. When they realise they're going to get caught out with some of this thing, they change the name. They change the name of the disease. And you'll see, as we look back, and I think we list quite a few of these in the book, where a disease over a period of years, sometimes decades, the same symptoms, what they called it 20 years ago, they call it something different, and then say, oh, we've eradicated that disease. The fact they've got a new one, they failed to mention. And that happens quite a lot. But just to make it quite clear on the point about polio, the records show quite clearly that once they'd removed the cause of the paralysis of spraying the crops with lead or DDT, then the cases and stopped vaccinating people with Salk's vaccine, then the cases of polio sort of dwindled away.
It was actually a double whammy, really, because it was lead arsenate, so not just lead but arsenic as well. So they were using that as a pesticide on crops before they started using DDT. So unfortunately, lead and arsenic are persistent in the environment. So the ground remains where they were sprayed. If they were heavily sprayed, that remains in the environment, in the ground, and continues to poison the earth. So some of these orchards or whatever, where various crops were grown, can't be, food or crops can't be grown on there now, and trees, it's still contaminated. So these are long-lasting effects. It's not just, it's stopped being used, so it's not a problem. It continues to be a problem.
And so it was cases like that that led us further and further into realizing what really makes you ill. And in every case, we found that no virus, no microorganism could be actually scientifically shown to cause any of these illnesses. It was always could be relatively easily found to be some toxic substance in the majority of cases. And as we've just said, in the case of polio, it was the insecticides, pesticides that were sprayed on the fruit and vegetables that people were eating. And we found this in every case, right from in the past, and we looked back, the majority of our research looked back over the last 150 years, but we did look at some cases like the Black Death and went back, even further to see what that was. We did look at the 1918 so-called Spanish flu to see what was the cause of that. And we can talk a little about that if you wish. But suffice it to say that in every case, we couldn't find any scientific proof for a germ of some sort to be the cause of an illness, but we could always find either a toxic substance or some other element, which, when I say element, I'm talking about, we boiled it down in our book to what we call our 4 factors of the root cause of every illness that sort of befalls man and beast, as it were. And they are lack of correct nutrition, because the body needs the correct level of nutrition. And we're not talking about correct level of food. We're talking about the right balance of nutrition, which we can talk about a little more. So that was the first factor. The second was an overload of toxicity, which can be something like the pesticides that were sprayed on these crops. EMFs, electromagnetic frequencies, the electrical radiation that we're more and more immersed in every day, and prolonged and high levels of stress, which have particular effects on the human body. And what we found is in every case of illness that it could be traced back to one or more of those 4 factors, always, and never to the cause by a germ of some sort. And that's really what the whole book lays out, and challenges the medical establishment to prove their case, because, as we rightly say, they've put forward a germ theory, and like with all theories, the onus is on the perpetrator of that theory, if you like, to prove their theory, and they never have. So, it's not really for us to disprove it, it's for them to prove it. If you say this germ causes that disease, then it's up to them to prove it, and they never have, whether it's a bacterium or a virus, never. And those papers don't exist. There's some fairly fictitious ones that have arisen on the internet, which we might just mention briefly. Even several of them appearing in the journal Nature, which is supposedly the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. And everything that appears in it is supposed to be peer-reviewed by a large panel of experts.
But we expose in the book as well that the peer review process is highly flawed, and
if not to say corrupt. Yes.
Well, yes, it's been described as an old boy network, so that's why the peer review process makes sure that the prevailing narrative is maintained, and no, shall we say, challenging views or new science is brought to the table. It's always kept out, because the peer review process makes sure that it's the scientists, the scientists who perform the peer review are the ones who are the supposed experts in the field. Only, of course, they're the ones expert in the field of the status quo, to maintain the status quo, because they don't want new theories challenging them, challenging their theories and their careers and their ongoing research. So they make sure that as far as possible, the peer review keeps everything within the mainstream view, shall we say.
So these papers that started going around the internet and appeared in the journals Nature which purported to say that they'd isolated the coronavirus and purified it and followed Koch's postulates and proved that it caused the disease. Okay, this is what these papers purported to do. Now, they were investigated. We've seen them, and people like Dr. Andy Kaufman and others have looked at them too. And Dr. Andy Kaufman did a very good job of taking them apart, shall we say, which is put on the internet. And just to make it brief, because what happens with these so-called scientific papers is the first part of it is what they call the abstract, which might be a paragraph or two, which purports to tell you what the whole paper is about. And most people never get past reading that abstract. So if they see an abstract and it's just a paragraph and it says, yes, we've isolated the virus, we've purified it, we've proved it causes the disease, that's as far as they go. What they don't do is read the full sorry about that. What they don't do is read the full methodology. What's going off with that? What they don't do is read the full methodology. And both Dr. Kaufman and ourselves have read that methodology. And when you read through it and take it apart to see what they actually did, they haven't done any of those things. But even better, when you get to the end of the methodology, they actually admit that they have not isolated the virus, they have not purified it, they have not met all of Koch's postulates, and they have not proved that it is the cause of COVID. And you think, well, in your abstract, you said you've done all these things, and at the end of it, you said you've not. I mean, that is fraud, surely is fraud, a complete lie and fraud. And Dr. Andy Kaufman says this. And if you read them and take the trouble to, they're pretty dry and technical things to go through. But if people, and that's why most people don't, but when you go through it, you think this is nonsense, and this shows, I think, the level of desperation that the establishment is going to lie to the public so they can put out papers. And for most people, it works. Most people see something like that and go, oh, you see, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You know, it's been proved that this virus exists, and it's been proved, you know, and it's in nature, because they never bothered to do the homework themselves. So that's just to give an example, as I say, of the fraud and lies that are put out at the highest level. This is Nature, the journal Nature, at the highest level by the establishment, to put out that level of deceit, which is, well, words fail me, really, and that's not very often.
It's extraordinary. I mean, it's just totally extraordinary. You know, originally my wife and I started looking into all of this because we were going to, you know, my wife was pregnant. We were going to have, you know, a baby, and we just wanted to look at the vaccination question just to make sure. You know, we believed in vaccination, and we, you know, like everybody else did, really, and you know, just wanted to do a little research before we, you know, did a pretty invasive medical procedure, and just double check it, you know, and all of a sudden the world started, you know, turning upside down as you start looking at all this. And then you know, what really blew me away is at first you realize, okay, that these things are dangerous, and then I came to understand they also are not effective. They're you know, the history that we've been told that they eradicated disease is just not true. I mean, it's just provably false. And then you get to, you know, the depths of understanding that your research really, you know, shows, which is that the entire model, the entire paradigm of disease is misconstrued. It's misunderstood. You know, I think one of the things that I think that was happening in our Corona crisis is that people are saying, oh my gosh, what's, you know, they're beginning to investigate the coronavirus itself and these questions of isolation. But I think one of the things that is really valuable for people to learn is that this sits in a very long history in which this has been going, you know, this kind of assertion that there is a germ causing disease, there's an attack from a microorganism causing disease, that this is a very long history here. And maybe, could you take us through that, where, you know, I think, you know, unlike the doctors or the biologists or the scientists, what you did an enormous amount of historical research. Can you take us through the historical research, maybe a little bit of a walk through history, and tell us about, you know, who was Pasteur, Robert Koch, other figures who asserted the germ theory, and what was, and whether there were people who spoke out at the time, who were they and what they said. You know, let's just really shoot through it all the way from the Black Death, you know, up through Pasteur and Robert Koch and so on. Can you walk us through that history?
Well, we can. Well, certainly we'll try. I mean,
it's huge.
Bearing in mind that it took 800 pages for us to write that down, so we can't remember all those details. We can give a bit of an overview. Dawn has certainly got a better memory for names than I have throughout the last 150 years, but we can give a few examples, I'm sure. And you did mention the Black Death. I mean, would you like us to just tell people a little bit about, because we've all heard of the Black Death, would you like us to talk a little bit about what our findings were about that? Because I think most people believe it's all to do with infected rat fleas, you know, and that was what was causing the so-called Black Death that swept across, you know, most of Europe, certainly, and killed millions of people. So yes, because we wanted to try out our hypothesis that we were finding everywhere we looked, we couldn't find that any disease was caused by a microorganism. So
what we kept doing was saying, but what about? the kind of questions that we are now being asked. So, well, if it doesn't work for this, well, what about this disease? What about that disease? So we wanted to look as widely as possible to cover the kind of questions that we knew, well, we were asking ourselves and talking amongst ourselves and asking each other, oh, how does that work? What about animals? And those kinds of questions.
And
so we went into, well, okay, let's have a look at the Black Death.
So we thought we'll go back to that, a really distant part of history, but something everyone's familiar with. We're all taught it at school. So we thought, let's have a look. Could this be an anomaly where some infectious agent, because that's what we were being told, infected rat fleas biting people and infecting them, and they were dying these horrible deaths. So let's have a look at what it was. Again, quite a long story, but we did come across a good piece of work by a professor, an Irish professor, Professor Mike Bailey, and we found that he'd written a book called New Light on the Black Death. And we were able to get some good insights from his work. Now, by profession, he's a professor of dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings, which you may think is a very bizarre thing to be studying. But what it was is because many trees live to have very long lives, thousands of years. I think the oldest tree they've ever found is about 5,000 years old. So they live very long lives, some particular trees. So he was well aware of this as a dendrochronologist. And so he wanted to have a look at, because he could tell from the tree rings what the Earth's atmosphere was like in any particular period of history.
And how they grew, because tree rings are not always the same. So different depths of the actual ring show whether the tree grew a lot in a particular year, because each ring is associated with a year, with a year's growth. And so in certain parts or in certain stages of the growth, there's faster growth, and in certain stages there was certainly not very much growth at all.
Well, but what he was able to deduce from these tree rings is that during the period of the Black Death, that the Earth's atmosphere became extremely toxic, in fact poisonous, and there was very high levels of ammonia and other sort of toxic gases that had permeated throughout the Earth's atmosphere. And he then started to correlate his findings with ice core samples, which correlated with the tree rings, that the ice core samples also showed that period of the Black Death, the Earth's atmosphere had become extremely toxic. He then sort of correlated that with eyewitness accounts of people alive at that time, and found that there were lots of eyewitness accounts talking about a very poisonous and choking and stinking atmosphere. Okay. And one of the most revealing things that I found was that there were reports of the rivers and lakes becoming so toxic that all the fish were floating to the surface dead. Well, straight away you can see that can't be anything to do with infected rat fleas, So, there's something else going on.
But the reports didn't include eyewitness accounts of millions of rats running around, or millions of dead rats all over the ground. I mean, dead animals by the water, but not necessarily lots of dead rats. So it certainly questioned the infected rat.
An archaeological digs within London in recent years have confirmed that now, that there should have been, because these infected fleas were supposed to kill the rats, the host, as well as infecting human beings, so there should have been lots of die-offs of rats. And so those examples of that should have been able to have been found in these archaeological digs that have been conducted in certain areas of London in recent years. And there weren't any. So again, you get all these things coming together to show that whatever was happening with the Black Death was nothing to do with infected rat fleas or anything to do with rats. There was this toxic atmosphere, and adding to where this toxic atmosphere could have come from, the professor found that there'd been high levels of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes at that time, around the world? Well, as we know, once the Earth starts opening up, either through volcanoes or earthquakes, it releases toxic gases and substances. And also, strangely, the eyewitness accounts talked about a comet coming close into the Earth's atmosphere. And so there was debris and who knows what could have been coming from that as well. So all of these things happened at the same time as the so-called Black Death. So we can see from these examples, and I'm just giving an overview here, that there's no evidence for infected rat fleas. And some of the other things that I looked at as well, with the spread of the disease, which was supposed to have spread almost instantaneously across Europe, and knowing how diseases spread, particularly if it was going to be through infected rat fleas biting people, they can calculate how fast a disease could spread under that regime. And it was impossible. They've said it was impossible for it to have happened. So it had to be something different. So all of these things coming together show that it was nothing to do with rats, nothing to do with infected rat fleas, but certainly something to do with a poisonous atmosphere. So it kills the whole idea that we'd been taught in school and everyone believed for years and years that the Black Death was something to do with infected rat fleas. And so that was, again, another eye-opener, how we could all be taught things that were totally untrue and not based in science at all. And, when you do some digging, you can find much more viable reasons for what was causing that. And as Dawn mentioned earlier, we decided as well that we'd extend into the area of animals, because we realised, well, if microorganisms don't cause disease in people, is it the same for animals? So we investigated a few so-called animal diseases, and we found exactly the same. And one of my favourites, if you can call it that, is because it was particularly peculiar to the UK and became known as mad cow disease. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with that term, and caused the slaughter of thousands and thousands of cattle in the UK. So we thought, and again, it was attributed to a disease, a germ of some sort infecting the cattle. So we thought, right, okay, let's have a look at this. Let's see if we can find out what the actual cause was. And again, cutting a long story short, we found what it was, and why it was peculiar to the UK is that the ministry, the government and the ministry insisted that farmers dipped their cattle in an organic phosphate dip, which was supposed to, wash them down with it, which was supposed to protect the hides against warble fly, which sort of penetrates and makes holes in the skin, and so makes the skin less valuable when the cattle are slaughtered and sold for leather. So purely a commercial decision. But what they'd failed to say is that, and why it was peculiar to the UK, is that the dose used in the UK, or that the ministry insisted on, was 4 times stronger than used anywhere else in the world. And what was happening, organophosphate is a neurotoxin, and at the strength it was used, it was soaking through the skin into the nervous system of the cattle and completely obliterating their control. And they couldn't stand up and they fell about, and hence they got called as if they'd gone mad. Well, in a way they had, but they'd been poisoned. And then, of course, they were slaughtered and whole herds were wiped out on the say-so of the ministry, all based really on a mistake of theirs, being so damn stupid as to put this high-dose organophosphate requirement on the farmers. And we found one farmer, whose name I'm sure Dawn will remember.
Yes, Mark Purdy.
Mark Purdy. And he actually wrote a book because he had a pedigree herd and he was a fairly clever farmer. And he absolutely refused to dip his cows. And
because he ran an organic farm.
Yeah. And he managed to, he had to fight the government, but he managed to win because he did his research and they couldn't make him dip his cows. And so consequently, none of his cows, none of his cattle got mad cow disease. And he wrote a book about it in the end. And again, we attribute some of the facts and figures that we dedicate in our book to his work and his personal experiences with his own herds of cattle and his fight with the ministry to stop them from using this organophosphate on his cattle, and hence his cattle were the only ones that were mad cow free, as it were. So again, our suspicions were proved correct. It was nothing to do with the germ. It was all to do with the poisoning, and in this case, organophosphate, which is extremely toxic. And the more you use of it, the stronger it is, the more toxic it is. And again, this is what we found. We looked at myxomatosis in rabbits, and again, we found the same sort of thing. It was all to do with poisoning being put down by farmers to kill off rabbits. It was nothing to do with a disease being transferred between rabbits.
Nothing to do with the virus.
Nothing to do with the virus, no. So we found this in all cases, whether it was humans or animals. No germ could be shown to be the cause, but we could always find a much more logical, practical reason as to why the animals or the people were becoming ill.
What was the disease with the rabbits that you found?
Myxomatosis.
Myxomatosis, yes, quite a mouthful, I know. Myxomatosis.
Yeah, and this was blamed on a virus, but then you found another reason for it. What was going on?
Well, it was tended to be either deliberate poisoning put down by the farmers, or some of the toxic, because they wanted to kill off the rabbit population in their particular farm area, because it was eating their crops, or it was certain pesticides that they were putting down to keep things off their crops. Pesticides, insecticides, which were slowly poisoning the rabbit population, either deliberately or supposedly unintentionally. So again, it was cases of poisoning, not an actual infection that was being passed from rabbit to rabbit. And that's we do talk about it in the book, but that's just a thumbnail sketch of what we found in every case, whatever we looked at.
I think there was a doctor who was looking at, I think Morton Biskind, who was looking at polio.
Yes.
And he found as well that the animals were getting sick at the same with similar symptoms to people. Did you guys ever come across that?
Yes, I believe we did as well. I think that there might be in the book as well. Yes, which is not surprising if it's an environmental toxin or some kind of toxic substance that the people and animals are coming into contact with at the same time, and that is far more a far better explanation for why people are ill at the same time, and even animals are ill at the same time if they're exposed to the same toxic substance in the environment or in the food or in the water or in the atmosphere.
Because the water was another thing, and we have problems with that even today, where farmers spray the fields with pesticides, insecticides, which are basically toxic, obviously because they're meant to kill the insects, and you get a wash off from the crops through rain into the watercourses, and of course that poisons the streams and lakes which those streams are running off to, and I've seen very sad cases of that, of dogs that have gone for a swim in a pool in farmers' grounds, and it's killed them because the level of toxicity in that water from wash off from the farmers' sprayed fields has come to such a level that it's toxic, certainly to a dog. That's a personal case, from a family member whose dog died just because of that. These are things that I've sort of come across personally, as well as people all around the world have come across this, but of course these things get hushed up for obvious reasons.
Right, definitely. Like, so Pasteur, like the whole basis for vaccines is like rabies and anthrax, right? And that's an animal case as well. Could you cover that?
Yes. Rabies is a particularly interesting one. We do cover both of those in the book. And rabies is, again, one of these, well, I'll call it a non-existent disease. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as rabies. I know that sounds crazy, but there isn't. And we've looked at it, and you cannot find, there is no disease that's called rabies. But of course, again, there's a great lot of money made out of having all your pets vaccinated before they can go anywhere. It's a huge money-making thing. But, you know, right back in Pasteur's day, you know, when you look at the science and the evidence around that time, you know, no one agreed with what he was doing and what he'd found. And again, even today, there is no scientific evidence to substantiate that there's a disease called rabies in animals. And there's a great case about, Dawn will probably remember the dates better than me, of one of the big dog pounds in America. I can't remember which town. Can you remember?
I think it was in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, that rings a bell. And over a period, they looked at over a period of 15 years. And for the thousands of dogs that had gone through those pounds and the amount of bites that the handlers had received, and over that 15-year period, no one had come down with rabies, you know, not one. And there was tens of thousands of dogs they'd handled over this 15-year period. And that was just, and that's on the record, you know. So it's a fiction. There is no such disease. That's the short answer to your question. Okay.
And tell us about Pasteur and what you discovered about Pasteur and what his role is in history and what else you discovered about him.
Okay, well, people should realize that Pasteur was a chemist, so he wasn't a doctor, you know, and he was also a plagiarist. He stole a lot of his ideas from a contemporary called Anton Béchamp, which you may have heard of, who was a genuine scientist and doctor. Much of the philosophy of the terrain, what's called terrain theory today, really stems from Antony Béchamp. But Pasteur was, as I say, a chemist, so that was all he knew. And his knowledge was very sketchy and non-existent about the human body and about disease. But he seemed to have developed some very powerful friends in France, and his ideas were taken on board by the, I think it was the emperor at the time, I think a relation to Napoleon. And so he had very high-level protectors, if you like. And so his ideas really gained traction because of his patrons, shall we say. But nothing based on science. And the genuine scientists and of the day, Béchamp among them, disagreed with everything Pasteur was coming up with, really, as unprovable and unscientific. But because of Pasteur's protectors, shall we say, those voices, like today, those voices were quashed and not listened to. I mean, there are rumours that we've not been able to substantiate this, but there are rumours that on Pasteur's dying days, if you like, that on his deathbed, he confessed that much of his work was, he'd left instructions that all of his diaries and work was to be destroyed, which should sound warning bells to anyone. Why would you want to do that? And that he admitted that the terrain was everything, the germ was nothing. This is the rumour that he was supposed to have said. Now, we've not been able to substantiate that, but it's very rife among certain areas. But the fact that he had all his records destroyed upon his death is...
No, he asked for them to be, but they weren't.
But not all of them were. And I think it was his son. Was it his son?
I can't remember, but yeah, somebody who, a relative of his, actually didn't destroy them, and he did keep them. And they ended up in the hands of, I believe his name is Professor Gerald Gyson, and who wrote a book about the actual... I can't remember the title of the book, but where the actual information that was in the diaries wasn't the same as the information that was published. And so his private diaries were very different from the information that he published, or the so-called science that he published. And
basically he was lying. basically it was lying. Well,
Yes, and it was, yeah, it's been caught out. So yes, that's
so a fraud, and people have, you'll see this a lot. It was basically shown to be a fraud.
But at the same time, he's still up there as a hero of the germ theory, and in the same way as Edward Jenner is for vaccination. But you know, that they're certainly they shouldn't be classed as heroes. They're some of the worst villains that have perpetuated the completely wrong paradigm of disease, health, the human body, and kept everything stuck in a model that was out of date 150 years ago, and is even more out of date, as can be seen by the fact that, you know, there is so much more so-called healthcare, but there's also an incredible increase in ill health, and people are not healthier than you know, they should be getting healthier. If modern medicine worked, people should be far healthier by taking the modern medicine, but they're not. People are experiencing worsening health, not better health.
I mean, the rise in heart disease and cancers, I mean, now they predict 1 in every 2 people will suffer from cancer at some stage in their life. My throat's gone a bit dry. Excuse me. You carry on.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, you carry on.
No.
And what specifically is Pasteur credited with, and what makes you feel that he was fraudulent about that?
Well, the main thing is really he's regarded as the father of the germ theory, and the fact is that no so-called germ, I mean, to make it clear, the particles that are called viruses aren't even alive, so they can't even be called microorganisms. But not just viruses, but bacteria, which are alive, their function in the body is completely misunderstood. And as more and more actual science has progressed over the last 150 years, it's now understood that bacteria are in fact extremely important within the body. Their function is, you know, to put it sort of fairly straightforward, that they're the cleanup crew. They help to break down and disintegrate and expel and eliminate dead and dying material. I mean, you can see that in the external environment. I mean, bacteria break down dead and dying matter out in the wild, if you like, out in nature. And if they didn't do that, we'd be miles high in you know, dead matter, but we're not, because they break it down, recycle it. So if they're doing that in the external environment, why would they have a completely different function that is destructive within the human body? Because the human body is the natural home of, you know, trillions of bacteria all the time. They're known to be positively beneficial within the digestive system, to help break down food and to release various nutrients and various other release nutrients into the body. So that's a beneficial action. And there is, you know, it's difficult to say, you know, that something is wrong, but it's, you can't prove that something doesn't happen. But what is known is the function of bacteria is beneficial within the body. And what is known is that there is no genuine evidence that any bacterium is the cause of any disease. Now, some of this can be supported by the fact that one bacterium, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is believed to be the cause of TB, and yet it's not uncommon for people with the symptoms and the diagnosis of tuberculosis, their bodily fluids, if you like, don't have that particular bacterium. It cannot be found. That particular bacterium cannot be found in their tissues. And if something is a cause, it needs to be there. Otherwise, if it's not there, how can it be a cause? And I mean, that's one of the Koch postulates, you know, the first one, you know, and that is pure logic. You know, if a disease organism, or if an organism is supposed to cause a disease, it needs to be present in every single case of that disease. And it should never appear in somebody who's healthy, who, in other words, hasn't got that disease. This is pure logic. This is common sense. And yet those basic fundamental common sense postulates, which are attributed to Robert Koch, are defied in just about every disease. And certainly in tuberculosis, it's a particularly good example, because that's the disease that Robert Koch was working with, and is supposed to have discovered that particular bacterium as the alleged cause of tuberculosis. And so that one fails. So if his basic premise of how he believes disease is supposed to be caused by a bacterium, if that falls apart, then you have to question all the other diseases that are claimed to be caused by bacteria.
And diphtheria is another one.
Yeah.
Exactly the same as tuberculosis. They find people who they say have got diphtheria, but they don't have the germ that's supposed to cause it. Well, that's just a nonsense. And the reverse of that, even things like strep throat, we have that. Everyone's got it in their bodies, but not everyone's got strep throat. So
E. coli is another example. It's supposed to be the cause of food poisoning, and yet E. coli, another bacterium, can be found readily found on the skins of healthy people. So it cannot be a cause of disease if it can be found in people who don't have the disease. And we just kept finding this in all sorts of cases. And so, it says, well, there's something fundamentally wrong with the theories being put forward that these bacteria cause disease.
But it also,
we show that this can't be the case.
But it also goes, the Koch postulates are the sort of supposedly the golden rules of the medical establishment. They're not our rules, they're their rules, and yet they break them all the time, or just ignore them when it doesn't suit them. So again, it's just another indication of how unscientific the whole medical establishment is. And this is what we found. It's the whole of the medical establishment is not based on science. It's based on dogma and vested interests and misunderstanding. And that's why we have the now becoming famous Voltaire quote on the back of our book, where he said that, if I remember it correctly, doctors are men that prescribe medicines of which they know little to treat diseases of which they know less in human beings of whom they know nothing. And nothing could be more true. It was true in the 1700s when Voltaire, very clever man, wrote that, and it's just as true today.
So,
sorry.
No. Let's just sort of dig in on that a little bit. If the bacteria like tuberculosis, E. coli, so on, are not the cause of illness, why are antibiotics sometimes successful? Can you sort of talk to us about what you discovered there?
Yeah.
Can I just say they may appear to be successful, and that's the thing.
But we'll give you a short introduction about antibiotics. Always claimed to be a wonder drug from when it was first penicillin was first brought into fashion, as it were, as an antibiotic. Easiest way to explain it is antibiotics. Think of the word antibiotics means anti-life. Okay, so that's your first clue, anti-life. So it's designed to kill things. Okay, antibiotics are very toxic to the body, and the body recognizes antibiotics as a toxin. And like any toxin, the body will try to get rid of it as quickly as possible. And when you take an antibiotic, the body is basically saying, this is extremely toxic. I need to get it out of my system as quickly as possible before it can cause any harm. And it kicks in the endocrine system in the body, which is a system of ductless glands which regulate all the hormones and things like that. So it kicks it into like overdrive to get this toxin out. And at the same time, of course, anything else that happens to be toxic in the body, it's basically flushing the system through. So it appears like the antibiotic has done the work, but it's really the body's done the work, but it's just been trying to get the antibiotic, recognized as a toxin, out of its system. And everything else that's toxic with it, which it would have got rid of anyway, but it may have done it a little bit slower and a bit more gentle. But the persistent use of antibiotics, which, if you can imagine, keeps firing up this endocrine system, eventually damages the endocrine system. It'd be a bit like over revving your car engine on a constant basis, running at really high revs, so your engine's screaming, and you're doing this all the time, eventually going to damage your engine. Well, that's exactly what happens to the endocrine system. So it no longer functions properly, and even antibiotics no longer appear to work. But what the medical establishment then says is, well, what's obviously happening is we're getting superbugs, which are now becoming resistant to the antibiotics. So we've obviously got to invent a stronger, more powerful new antibiotic, which we can charge lots of money for, of course, to the medical centres around the world. And that's a thumbnail sketch of what happens. So the antibiotics it's just introducing another toxin into the body. The body is more than capable of looking after itself. A healthy body, that is more than capable of looking after itself. But what tends to happen is the body, we can go into this, the body is under a constant assault from external toxins in what we breathe, in the processed foods we eat, in the chemical sprays that get sprayed on everything, in household cleaning products, even in the clothes we wear with the dyes and plasticizers that are in them. We list all of these out in the book so people can see the multitude of sources for toxic material that their body is subjected to on often a daily basis. And your body is trying to cope with that all the time. And sometimes it gets overwhelmed, and you start to then have detoxifying crises, which people normally recognize as what they would call a cold or the flu in a more, but which they are told is an infection. They've caught a cold or they've caught the flu, and that it's some infectious agent. But as we discovered in the 1918 so-called flu, no infectious agent was ever discovered and could never be proved to be the cause of the disease. And they tried many times during the 1918 flu epidemic to try and infect people with it, volunteers, prisoners in many cases. They tried to infect them. They took unhealthy people with supposedly the flu and took excretions from their nasal passages and throats and introduced them into the nasal passages and throats of healthy people to try and infect them. And never once, so they did this dozens and dozens of times, and never once were they able to infect a healthy person by that method. So that quite clearly showed that there's not an infectious agent at play. And there certainly wasn't. And we found lots of different reasons as to what was causing the illnesses and deaths in 1918. So again, well, we'll perhaps talk a little bit about 1918 because it's
a direct parallel to what's going on now.
Yeah.
Tell us about 1918 and what you found. And
well, actually, there's one element about the 1918 flu that isn't a parallel, or doesn't parallel now, and it's one of the elements that actually is quite often sort of missed out, and that is that it was the end of just about 4 years of what was a war that covered most of the world. I mean, I know. The Americans didn't join it until 1917, so maybe it's less.
that's not a dig.
No, not at all. What I mean is, it's probably less significant in America because it was only, they only took part for sort of something like a year or so. But within Europe, I mean, obviously not throughout the entire world, but I mean, within Europe, the war had been going on for 4 years, and it took its toll. Not just physically for the men that were killed, it took its toll emotionally and mentally. And as David mentioned before, one of the 4 factors that causes people to be ill is prolonged emotional stress. Now, you can't get much more prolonged and emotional stress than being, in a war for 4 years. I mean, not everyone was actually sustained the entire period. A lot of men were killed, but the war effort involved a lot of toxic materials. I mean, known about the chlorine gas attacks. Now, didn't necessarily kill people, but it certainly weakened them, made them enfeebled, and certainly with their respiratory systems, it would have attacked their tissues and weakened them, and possibly other factors would have helped to cause their deaths. So that's just one of the factors we found. But I mean, it's a particularly that's a particular difference from what's going on now. Although what's going on now is a war of, if you like, of fear, but that was a physical war where people were being killed, and it was pretty much around the entire world. So it did affect.
But the other factors that we found, and there were multiple factors, the first of which we should just point out that looking at the figures of how many people were supposed to have died of the so-called Spanish flu, ranged from, and these are the official figures, it ranged from 20 million worldwide to 100 million. Now, when you've got official figures coming out between 20 million and 100 million, you think, oh, these can't be accurate figures, can they? So do you actually know, Mr. Officialdom, do you actually know how many people have died of anything? Well, no, they don't. So what they were doing is lumping all sorts of things together. So what the official figures are, or what the actual figures are of what people died of and how many died is actually unknown. But what we did find is there are a certain amount of deaths that did happen. And as Dawn said, some of them, certainly one of our 4 factors, which was this prolonged stress. Imagine being in a trench, up to your knees in mud and water, and people are trying to kill you every day. Pretty stressful. Secondly, of course, the people in those wars were living on army rations, which were not nutritious. They were just basic, keep you alive, but were not feeding the body with proper nutrition. You weren't getting plates of fresh fruit and vegetables. You're just getting sort of like hardtack biscuits, which you can chew on if you could not break your teeth. So very poor nutrition, very poor nutrition. So second factor, so you've got prolonged extreme stress, lack of nutrition.
Poor conditions in the trenches also include, they obviously didn't have plenty of indoor plumbing, and there was obviously dead bodies around. They weren't always able to bury them. So, you've got decomposing, putrefying bodies around.
So very insanitary conditions.
Very insanitary.
And as Dawn said, with munitions, the materials used in munitions and explosives extremely toxic. So it's not only the stuff they're handling, but the air would be filled with it when the shells, some of these bombardments went on for days, so the air would have been filled with toxic gases from the exploding shells. So if you weren't killed by an actual explosion, you'd probably die from the toxic output from these things. So that's the third of the 4 factors, okay? And then the final one, which is a little bit more mysterious, came into effect in the latter part of the war, and that was the telecommunications. So we're bringing in electromagnetic fields. Now, we're talking 1917, going back, before, when they started to be erected, and particularly in some of the army camps in America, very powerful radio transmitters, okay, which put out extremely strong electromagnetic fields. And some of the early reports of people dying very quickly and mysteriously were in those camps. And when we investigated what it was, we found strange effects that people were dying of, and they died very quickly. There wasn't what you normally assume, a few weeks of feeling really rotten, and then, you slowly demise. People were just becoming ill within hours or a day and dropping down dead. And when they were examined, they were found they'd got hemorrhaging inside, internal hemorrhaging, particularly brain hemorrhages, which of course is something that no one would associate with influenza. But you do associate it with high-powered electromagnetic fields. And these sorts of cases were happening around these very powerful radio transmitters. And this could be traced into all sorts of areas of the world at that time, in that period. And quite some good work had been done on that in a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, which he goes into purely the electrical side of things on that. And also, there was high-dose aspirin had been introduced, which is also, at the levels that it was given, extremely toxic. So you've got all of these factors.
And another factor that is often talked about and sort of fairly commonly talked about is the fact that all the soldiers were being given multiple vaccines. Yes. And quite often, there are quite a number of reports of soldiers, particularly in US military camps, that were vaccinated, never actually got out to active duty, that they died. Within the camps, but also even if they were made ill after vaccines, then they were in the army hospital in the camps, and they were given all sorts of treatments, including the kind of aspirin levels, and so they didn't stand a chance. They were again poisoned. So it was a combination.
And these were healthy young men. Well,
the army always recruits the healthiest, don't they?
So it's when these sorts of people are dying from these things, then it's hardly surprising that to a lesser extent you're going to get people outside of those who are not so strong and healthy. But we found that these were the sort of factors, the combination of factors that could be seen to be in effect in the so-called Spanish flu. Influenza is not a disease anyway. It's a misnomer. It's as we can talk about, it's a body detoxing, and employing the mucous membranes as part of getting all the toxins out of your body is a natural thing that the body does. So anyone who was showing those sorts of symptoms shows that the body has become toxic for whatever reason. But as we've just been discussing, I know I've only given a thumbnail sketch, we do talk about it more in the book. There are a number of factors at play, and not least of which was the high stress of a world war, that was leading to undoubtedly large numbers of deaths, not only in the military, but also in the civil population as well, who are also suffering these same and similar deprivations of lack of food, high levels of stress, homelessness, even exposure to the radar installations and radio telecommunication installations. So these are what we found were the common factors that would be leading to ill health and death around that period of time. And it's best for people to forget about the numbers because they're totally unreliable. I mean, give an example of India. According to the official figures, 20 million people died of the Spanish flu in India. Okay, now they blamed it on the people in India being infected by the returning troops, the troops returning back from the war. But what they neglected to, unless you look at the figures, you'll see that the people in India were dying before the troops actually got back to the mainland. Bearing in mind, people were traveling on relatively slow ships then, so it took them weeks to get back. It's not in an aircraft and parachute in. So it can't have been because of any infection, because the troops weren't even there. They arrived later. People were already supposedly dying of the Spanish flu before anyone had even got there. So it's all these anomalies put together and all these other indications that you can see there was something else going on, which then all got lumped together by the authorities and labelled a disease. Because when people look into it, you can soon start to point the finger at the authorities, lack of care, incorrect treatment, subjecting people to high levels of electromagnetic radiation. So questions could be asked and people could get sued. And so it's much better to blame it on a disease than it is to admit the truth. And we found this happens a lot. And as someone once said, it's much better to blame a virus because you can't sue a virus. And that's probably a very true word, but you can sue chemical companies and military organizations and pharmaceutical companies with high-dose aspirin and all the rest of it. They can be sued. So much better not to talk about that and to talk about a virus being the cause of it instead.
The invisible enemy.
The invisible enemy, yes. Once again.
It has such a, it brings you right back to this idea of the Catholic Church saying, well, it's it's demons, it's witchcraft, it's sorcery. You know, did you ever find? I sort of wasn't planning on asking you guys about this, but did you ever find any sort of connections ideologically between these sort of ancient ideas of invisible enemies and?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, we didn't delve into it in any great detail, but certainly the idea of some kind of disease entity attacking you seems to have been a sort of a natural development of the idea of, you know, miasmas and these demons. You know, it does seem to be a natural progression that there's something nasty out there that's going to get you, and invisible, but at the same time, it allows you know, the sort of general public, if you like, to be under control, because, you know, you've got to do the right thing, otherwise these nasty things will get you. And if you are ill, this nasty thing has got you because you've been naughty, you've done something bad. So it's all back to blaming the person. And again, with what we're saying about how what disease really is, which is something that's developed within the body, we're not blaming the victim, as it were, but what we're doing is explaining what actually is the cause of what are called diseases, you know, the symptoms, so that people can understand how they become ill, which means that they can then take responsibility for their own actions and then take responsibility for their own health, because they are in charge of their own body and their own health. They're in control, not of everything, but in a great deal of what they put in and on their bodies. So there are circumstances that, you know, we can't have any control over, but there are plenty that we can. So we can do more towards helping ourselves, and including the mental aspect as well, which is very important at the moment, that people are being made to be fearful, and not just fearful of some invisible enemy, but fearful of every other human being that they might come in contact with. So this is something that must be dispelled, because it's feeding something that's, again, like you say, going back to the fear of the demons, you know, that now suddenly every other person around you has become the demon. So it is a kind of continuation of those ideas that there are these sort of evil spirits out there that can get you, that transformed into the evil germs that can get you. And now apparently evil people can spread their nasty germs and make you ill. So
and it's worth just drawing the parallel that going, as we were just saying, going back when, because people didn't understand why they got ill, and so it was attributed to evil spirits, something unseen. And of course there would always arise up either the so-called sort of shaman or witch doctor who would assume responsibility to drive out the evil spirit and make people well with his lotions and potions or certain dances or waving of special sticks. And that slowly progressed into the church, particularly the Catholic Church, we'll say, with possession. Again, we're dealing with invisible spirits making people ill, and the church could assume authority to drive out those spirits, again giving themselves the authority and the special ceremonies for driving those spirits out. So again, you were then subservient to a level of authority. So you move from the sort of shaman witch doctor to the priest, and lo and behold, you now move and give your authority for your health to the man in the white coat in the hospital or the doctor's surgery, who now assumes authority for your health, because you as an individual are helpless and must defer to these experts who know all about it and know what to do. So there is a progression from sort of fairly primitive times and unseen, unknown entities through, as Dawn has said, unseen and unknown entities today, all unproven all the way through for thousands of years right up to today, all based not on science, all based on fear and superstition. And here we are in the 21st century, and we're still there. We're still, for the majority of people, are giving away their power to men in white coats who assume authority over them and tell them that they know what they're doing and you don't as a normal human being. We're the experts, because we've got the white coats on and the stethoscopes, and we've spent 4 years in med school, so we know all about it, and you must do what we tell you. And for the majority of times, that's what people do. They give away their power, and they give away their wisdom and their knowledge.
They believe, and again, this sort of ties back to where we even started with looking into the nature of illness, because we came across something that's called the placebo effect, where people can be given an inert, a sugar pill, and can recover from something that they think is wrong with them. These are used in experiments. Some people are given a particular drug, and other groups of people are given a placebo, so that they can see what particular effect the active drug has. But they've discovered, or they have discovered many decades ago, that some people who take an inert pill, a sugar pill, can actually recover from a health problem. So this is a phenomenon, it's known, and obviously it's kind of comes under, the power of the mind. Now, as well as the placebo effect, there is the opposite, which is called the nocebo effect. And that can be likened, as David was talking about, the shamans and the witch doctors and people like that, where it's also called the voodoo hex, where if you like, the shaman can say, you've got to do something like that, or have a curse put on them, and if you don't do something or other, this curse will take effect and you will die in 3 months. And it's well recorded that many people within that particular time frame, the 3 months, they die with nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're not ill, they don't have any disease, but they absolutely believe in it. Now, this is not just out in the kind of, the wilds of, these strange tribes. This happens, this is recognized within the medical establishment. And it's shown by something called dying of the diagnosis. Many people are given a diagnosis of say cancer, which is probably one of the most one of the diseases people believe is a huge problem, and they say, oh, okay, doctor, how long have I got? And so the doctor says 3 months or something like that. And in many cases, the people have been known to die in that period, and on autopsy they've been found that they don't have enough pathology in their body to have actually died of that disease. And so they've taken that belief, they've absolutely believed in it, and they have died according to the diagnosis. I mean, it's tragic, yes. There is the opposite, where people who are given a diagnosis and they say, actually, no, thank you. I'm not going to have that. I don't accept that diagnosis. They don't invest in it. They don't believe in it. They don't make that part of their life. And they actually carry on absolutely fine and have a normal life. So it's not just the emotional stress, if you like, it's how people believe in things, how people allow other people to affect what they do in their lives, and the actions that they take and the responsibility they have for their own lives. And that's why this is so important, that the more people are fearing and believing that there is some nasty, dangerous, invisible enemy out there, this could actually be causing many people to become ill, and possibly even some people die because they believe, because they had a snivel, somebody somewhere coughed over them, they had a snivel, I've got it, and they go down that path. And that's why it's important for people to realise that this fear, this whole idea, it's a very real phenomenon. It's well known, but as I say, the nocebo effect is well documented.
I mean, we were talking to a doctor only about a week ago who worked in a hospital still in the States, and has a lot to do with the accident and emergency department. And he told us stories of, in the early days certainly, of this coronavirus nonsense. People were being brought in, feeling a bit rough, sniffly, coughing. And he said the whole place went mad. He said, you've got doctors running about saying, oh, we've got another one, get your masks on, get your gowns on, and they're dragging these poor people on, frightening the life out of them, and rushing them into theatres and isolation, and he said it's hardly surprising these people die. He said they'd scare the life out of them. When you imagine that happening to you, you're being dragged in, and suddenly that sort of pantomime is carrying on around you, with people all gowning up and masking up and gloving up and dragging you off into isolation and basically telling you you've got some deadly disease which is probably going to kill you, but we'll do our best. But we're going to make sure it doesn't kill us. I mean, and this is in a hospital, and this is, recent times. This is this year,
Yeah, I mean, it's so bad. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Wall Street Journal article about a couple of weeks ago where the doctor actually admitted to saying, this is a doctor in Chicago, he actually admitted to saying, look, we didn't put our inpatients on the respirators for their benefit. We were scared that their exhalations were going to make all of us sick. And it was printed in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, he basically was admitting to murdering his patients to protect his staff. That's how strong the fear was.
And how strong the ignorance is. And this is from doctors. This is not, as I say, it's very difficult for us, knowing what we know, to have any respect at all for the mainstream doctors, because, without their ignorance and without the things they're saying, and I'm talking about the majority of them, if it wasn't for them saying what they're saying, we wouldn't be in the trouble we're in. If they just do some proper research themselves, and it doesn't take very much, and they could see very well that this is nonsense, and of course they're aided and abetted by a bought and paid for media. These script readers who just come on the talking heads on the telly, they know nothing. They don't know anything about anything. They just read what they're told. They're getting very nicely, highly paid jobs. And the people who run and own the corporations, the media corporations, it comes down the line as to what they're going to say. And we all saw, in, 2019, was it, in the Event 201? We actually saw in October where they were planning this. They were quite open about it, what they were going to do, and just a few months later, they did it. And, that people should be able to go, come on, we saw you planning this. You said it was all fictitious and a dummy run at the time. And literally a few months later, you did it, and you're still doing it. How can we believe anything you tell us? But people do. And so it's very difficult to not get quite angry with the general public when we see them so easily suckered in, as it were, on this bunch of lies. And no matter, it really is a difficult situation. And it seems that no matter how much technical information you put in front of them to show them that this is a complete fallacy, there is no science behind this COVID nonsense. There is no science behind wearing masks and social distances. None at all. And it's easily disprovable. I mean, they can't listen. They'd sooner listen to what Fauci says, or in America, or this Hancock guy in the UK, the BBC News or CNN. They'd sooner listen to that than any sensible science, or even to employ logic, I mean, the masks are a prime example, aren't they? With the mesh size of mask, we've often pointed this out to people, with the mesh size of a mask, which is measured in micrometers, and the size of a so-called virus particle, which is measured in nanometers, and a nanometer is 1,000 times smaller than a micrometer. Common sense tells you, even if there was a virus, it would go straight through the damn mask, So there's no protection at all. And yet people, they've got the masks on. And these are doctors, absolutely insistent on it. Say, come on, guys, a little bit of basic science or a bit of basic engineering will tell you that's not going to do anything, even if there was a virus around. It would do nothing at all to protect you. And yet they still carry on with this farce.
It's so deeply ingrained in people's psyches at this point that there are, I think that there's two ideas. One, that there are, these dangerous germs that are going to get you, and then also, that the authority of the medical establishment is totally sacrosanct and legitimate, and that those two factors together are like a fulcrum that can be used to completely change our, to throw away the most ancient rights of our society. If those two things together, it's just phenomenal what people are willing to do. Can you? I don't want to forget to ask you this because I thought your research on smallpox was really great. Can you take us through what you found when you looked at smallpox, and just kind of take us through all that?
Sure. Did you want to talk about smallpox?
Well, yes. I mean, we've got sort of a couple of discussions on smallpox. One of them is because it was the first disease that a vaccine was developed for. That goes back to Edward Jenner. I can't remember the exact year. But smallpox, like other diseases called pox, are just sort of eruptions on the skin. And those eruptions are a natural part of the body's detoxification system. And so they would arise when people were living in, or rather smallpox kind of developed when people were living in fairly insanitary conditions. So they were exposed to contamination, animal waste. There was no indoor plumbing, so their bodies built up with toxins, and so the skin would erupt and the sort of pustules would form. But that's the poison coming out. That's a process. It's not a specific disease, but it was called smallpox. And trying to keep this brief, Edward Jenner, again, not a medical doctor. He was a chemist as well, I think, and he had this idea that there was a disease of cows called cowpox that was somewhat milder than the disease called smallpox, and if people had cowpox, then they wouldn't get such a virulent form of smallpox later. They're still believing that these diseases were contagious, but this was long before the germ theory and Pasteur. So it's just the idea that these diseases were contagious, not necessarily knowing what it was that caused it. So for whatever, the vaccine was developed, and again, he's a false hero because everyone says, oh, he was the first one, he created the vaccine and it cured people, it stopped people having smallpox. Well, again, if you look at the facts that are recorded of the time, the experiments he developed the experiments he conducted weren't as successful as they are claimed to have been. And in fact, the vaccines didn't prevent any cases. Now, it was quite convenient at the time. Again, the early days of the British medical system, and they believed, somebody took him on, believed him, and thought it was a good idea, developed the vaccine, and that then became an established practice within England. Because that's where it all started at the beginning. And at some later stage in the 19th century, the vaccination became mandatory. And it was about for 40 years, there was mandatory vaccination for smallpox. And the statistics show quite clearly that as the vaccination percentage increased, so did cases of smallpox, not just cases, but also deaths from smallpox. So that wasn't particularly successful. A result of vaccination preventing disease. It actually was shown quite clearly to be a cause. And when the vaccination was finally stopped from being mandatory, the cases and deaths from smallpox dramatically reduced. At one stage there were sort of tens of thousands of people dying from smallpox, and once the vaccination stopped, the cases reduced to just a small handful.
I And what we found with things like smallpox is looking at, apart from the vaccinations, statistically, and these are from the official report, show quite clearly, the vaccination period increased the rate of smallpox, and getting rid of the vaccinations, it decreased. But the whole thing can be related, and the graphs are there to show it, that the rates of smallpox are directly attributable to the rate of insanitary conditions and poor dietary conditions. And wherever you see that, anywhere in the world, even today, wherever you see insanitary conditions and poor dietary conditions, you will see outbreaks of so-called smallpox. Once you take those insanitary conditions and provide proper nutritional food, the smallpox cases disappear.
So, one of the things with smallpox is that it is claimed to be the only disease that, or the only human disease that has been totally eradicated. What is particularly interesting is that it's claimed to have been eradicated by a worldwide vaccination campaign between the 1960s, 1970s. And so that gives the sort of the light of vaccination. But I mean, the point is that we found on the WHO website, there is a page that discusses the smallpox vaccine. And the question is, I think it's a Q&A web page, and one of the questions is, you know, why isn't the smallpox vaccine, or is the smallpox vaccine still given? And the reply includes the statement that it's not used very often because it can have potentially dangerous and even fatal consequences. So in other words, it is recognised now that it can cause illness and death, and yet it is claimed to be the reason that smallpox has been eradicated. And one of the phrases that we use quite often is, you cannot poison a body back to health. And so this, you know, and this is a perfect example that a vaccine that is recognized by the WHO to be potentially fatal, but certainly dangerous, has dangerous side effects, is the reason that they got rid of a disease. It absolutely makes no sense. But as David said, the real reasons for the eradication of smallpox is due to improved health conditions, improved environmental conditions, improved living situation and plumbing and sanitary measures, and improved diet. Unfortunately, things are now kind of going back the other way, and these situations and these conditions are worsening. And certainly in certain inner cities, you know, you get the sort of slums, and therefore certain diseases are now kind of increasing again. And again, it's referring to these conditions as diseases because there are, and that's why the subtitle is, you know, why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong, is because there are no separate diseases. There are lots of different symptoms that people experience, and a disease label is given to a certain set of symptoms. But these are only ever sets of symptoms, and the symptoms are all related to the body's efforts to clear out the toxins and repair the damage and restore itself to health, because it's always the body that is responsible for healing itself. And the body's trying to do that all the time. And that's what all these different symptoms are, whether it's a fever, a runny nose, spots, rashes, lumps, bumps, pustules, they're all the body's way of clearing out toxins. And depending on the toxin, depends on the actual nature of the symptom. So certain toxins will come out through the skin, some will come out through, you know, the nasal passages, and you know, if it's really serious, it will come out. It
depends on the body's toxic load as well. Under normal circumstances, the body's normal elimination processes, which is through excretion and through urination, are sufficient. Through sweating, you know, the skin is the body's largest organ, so it can sweat toxins out through the body. But sometimes those first lines of the defense get overwhelmed by the level of toxic intake. And so that's when, as I say, it brings in the mucous membranes. So you get the coughs mucus through the nose and nasal passages, through the throat
chest.
and chest,
Yes.
because it's trying to draw the toxins out and get them out of the body. And then these get labelled as colds and flu. Then
Or pneumonia.
or pneumonia, even depending on the severity of it. But these are elimination processes. And again, as I think Bill mentioned, if it's still having trouble getting rid of the toxins, it can start pushing them out through the skin, coming out in blisters and skin eruptions and rashes of one sort or another. And the worst thing you can do really is start trying to suppress those symptoms, whether it's the sort of catarrh type effects. If you start taking over-the-counter stuff to try and suppress them, then you're just stopping those toxins from coming out. You're actually stopping the body from doing what it knows how to do. If you start to suppress any of these elimination processes that the body goes through naturally, you're actually going to delay yourself getting better, or it basically, if you think of it, may push the toxins back in again, so you can't get them out, and then you'll have a recurrence maybe a few weeks later or a month or so later.
Or even worse is that what happens if the elimination doesn't occur and the toxins get kind of go deeper into the system and start affecting all the tissues and organs. You end up, that's how chronic diseases will develop. And much more serious conditions. So that's why not dealing with these lesser symptoms, and it is the best thing to do is to leave them to actually leave the body to deal with it. It's not to suppress them, but the more you suppress, not only are you stopping the original toxins coming out, but you're using toxic materials to add to the toxic load, so it just builds up. And that's how chronic conditions develop, things like tuberculosis or the more serious chronic conditions.
Did you were talking about unsanitary conditions as a cause of smallpox? I mean, you talked a lot about that in your book. What is it, if it's not germs in the unsanitary conditions, what is it about these unsanitary conditions that's making people ill?
Waste matter, waste material.
When things are breaking down, they break up into various chemical component parts, if you think of it in those terms. So let's take meat, for instance. Now, at one stage, the meat is edible, but if it starts to break down and putrefy, it's not the germs that are on it, the bacteria that are breaking it down. It starts to break down into other chemical components, think of it that way, which can be toxic, poisonous to the body. And it's those that we're talking about when we talk about insanitary conditions, where you've got lots of not only human waste, but all sorts of waste, chemical waste and things like that in these very poor areas that exist even today. That's what we're talking about, where you've got these things that are going to get into the water supply and the food, and they've broken down to an extent where they're toxic to the human body. So you've no longer got clean water, you've no longer got clean anything. So you're actually poisoning yourself with what you're eating and drinking. Nothing to do with germs, even washing in it. I mean, even today, we in the UK, back at the water stations, they add chemicals to our water supplies. They add fluoride and chlorine, and they've started adding ammonia now, all on the basis of either making your teeth better or killing germs. Now, all of those things, fluoride is a neurotoxin, chlorine and ammonia, all of these things are highly toxic, and yet they're putting them in our water supply to supposedly keep us healthy. So we in the UK, certainly in our homes, have to either have distillation units or reverse osmosis units to take out those toxins so that we can actually have clean water to drink. Now, but most people don't have that. So every time they have a drink of water or a cup of coffee or something, they're taking in toxins so they're slowly being poisoned.
But it's not just those toxins. I mean, it's well known that industrial effluent that goes into the water system is not removed by the processes in the water treatment plants. They can't process those kind of chemicals, and pharmaceuticals are another group of chemicals that will pollute the water. I mean, obviously, that's not the case when, going back to the 19th century of what the contaminants were. But I mean, these were human and animal wastes, which when they break down, they produce noxious either fumes or whatever, but they also poison the water. And there's that case of, it was called cholera, that people were ill and dying in a particular area, and it was discovered that by somebody who turned off a water main, that people stopped being ill, and they said, oh well, it was because of the water that was coming from there. Now it's often called or it's claimed that the disease is cholera that's caused by a bacterium, and so it was the bacteria that was causing the cholera, but it wasn't. The water was contaminated. It wasn't clean water, and so people were ill because they were drinking contaminated water. And it's not the bacteria. There were the waste materials. When animals start to decay and putrefy, that's not healthy to expose yourself to. This is part of nature. It's breaking down, but it's not something that you would eat.
Or drink, yeah.
Well, you wouldn't want to eat that. I mean, I know there are animals that do, but I mean, that's all part of the cycle of life, where certain creatures, help to break down dead and dying material out in the environment to recycle. But while it's putrefying, it certainly is not something that people should eat. And if they do, that's why they're sick. But it's not the bacterium. It's because whatever it is not fresh, and it's already putrefying.
So it's a chemical, essentially chemicals are created, or how would you characterize what the toxins are from, human waste, dead bodies, rotten food? How would you sort of characterize what is that? Is that well explained versus a bacteria, which is a living organism? So these are not living organisms.
These are chemicals. Think of them in terms
chemical
of
breakdown.
Chemical breakdown. And it's that things break down into sort of certainly living tissue as they rot. They become toxic to humans. And I think it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to imagine a piece of steak left out in the garden for a few days or a week. And then if you thought, well, I'll try and eat that, one is it will probably taste pretty disgusting, and I would be extremely surprised if it didn't make you ill. But I'll bet if there'll be bacteria on it, because they'll be breaking it down. But it's, as we've shown, and as our research shows, it is not the bacteria that makes you ill. And they are doing their job to break it down.
Recycling.
To recycle it. But it's the state that things go through, the processes they go through as they break down into their constituent parts. I mean, I can't sit here and tell you what each of those would be, because it'd be different for everything anyway, depending on what it was that was breaking down. But it gets to a stage, and it doesn't take much to imagine, it'll get to a stage where it is going to be toxic for a human to eat. Something that would make you ill. It will make you sick at the very least.
Well, the body no longer recognises it as food, and so that's why the body will reject it. That's what the symptoms are. It's making you ill because the body is saying that's not food. I want to get it out, and the more obviously toxic it is, the more shall we say sort of strong the reaction will be. So something that's particularly toxic, the body is more likely to react pretty violently to it.
Yeah. I mean, we see this even with things like alcohol. we might all like a glass of beer or a glass of wine, but we all know that if you drink too much of it, to start with, it's very nice and makes you feel very nice. But if you keep drinking it, you get to a stage where because alcohol is toxic to the body, but the body can tolerate so much of it, but it gets to a point where it can no longer tolerate it, and it will make you ill, even though to start with it was making you feel really pretty good. And food can be the same. It can get to a stage where it's no longer being beneficial to you. It's actually become toxic to your body and will make you ill. But anyway,
it's such a clear paradigm. Are there I'm saying it's like we were talking to Jim West. I don't know if you know the polio researcher.
Yes,
Jim,
we know of him.
He's great. He's really funny, and he's really he's done so much great research, and and he had this great experiment. He said, look, if they really think that the virus spreads and they really think they've isolated it, well, why don't they just inject it into 10 mice and put the mice into a room with 1,000 mice and see what happens? But they never do this unbelievably simple experiment, which would probably cost under $5,000, as opposed to these $1 million genetic sequencing experiments that they do. This very simple idea that there are toxins in fecal matter, in unsanitary matter, in rotten food, in dead bodies. These get dumped in the water. The bacteria eat them, but if you separate out the bacteria themselves, the bacteria don't make you sick, but this material does. Is that pretty clear in science? I mean, if you go looking for it, you can find that.
Yeah, because as we said, going right back to the germ theory part of it, it's never been proven. I know we've talked a lot about viruses, never been proved to cause disease, but it's the same with bacteria. They've never been proved to cause a disease. They are living things, and it's been quite, as Dawn said right at the beginning of all this, they populate the body. It's part of the body, natural maintenance system. Without them, we'd die. We wouldn't even be able to digest our food. So bacteria are essential to us.
And the planet.
And the planet, nothing would be able to live without bacteria. So, they're very important. So it stands to reason that they're not going to be one moment really beneficial and then very harmful. So that's sort of logic. But then you'd have to say, well, okay, it might be logical, but it's not particularly scientific. Let's see if we can prove it. Can we prove that bacteria actually make people ill? And they can't. They've never proved that bacteria or viruses make people ill.
Don't they have experiments where they've taken a bacteria, say an E. coli, isolated it, which must be very simple for such a large organism, and then made animals sick with that?
No.
Well, I would question whether they actually used the purified bacterium on its own. What usually happens is that they like you say, they inject the bacterium along with other things into into animals, but that doesn't prove that it's the bacterium if there's something else there. The other thing is that injecting isn't the normal route of any kind of so-called infection. So anything that's injected is already a completely unnatural route, and it's quite likely that whatever the subject will react to being vaccinated, to having something actually injected into the body. Now, it's highly unlikely, as I said, that it's a purified bacterium on its own in that vaccine or in anything else. The experiments that have been done during the sort of 1918 flu, people were coughing in each other's faces. I mean, it was believed at the time that it was caused by a bacterium. But there were also experiments where they were trying to inject the bacterium they thought was responsible into people, and people weren't becoming ill.
even though that was an unnatural way to introduce it.
Exactly.
But I mean, the experiments that they've done where they've said they've proved that they've caused an infection, I mean, we briefly touched on one a little earlier, and it's the one about polio, where they said they'd been able to transmit polio to a couple of monkeys. But when you look at what the experiments were, they'd taken from an animal that was supposed to have had it, an infected animal, and ground up its brains and spinal cord, made an unhealthy mix of that, put it into a syringe, drilled a hole in the monkeys' heads and injected it into their brains. And then when the monkeys became paralyzed, they said, there you go, see, that shows you that polio can be transferred to another animal. Really? I mean, that doesn't prove it at all.
Just proves that poison is harmful.
That if you inject poisonous material into someone's brain, it will make them ill. Yeah, you've proved that. But, no. But that was their proof for polio as an infectious disease. And that's in the records,
Yeah, that's so crazy because they went from that poor proof to like not even trying to prove eventually. Like, if you could highlight, like Kary Mullis, he had the same journey. He was like looking for that proof. If you could highlight that, that'd be great. He was looking for that proof, and he looked and asked and didn't find. And that was crazy when I saw that for the first time. I was like, oh my goodness, this Nobel Peace Prize inventor of the test is like asking a simple question and he can't get the answer. Could you cover that? And also, could you cover like the lack of proof of sexual transmission for HIV and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, we get asked a lot about sexually transmitted diseases, quite a lot. It's obviously quite a lot of interest to a lot of people, most people, in fact. And the short answer is, we did look at it for obvious reasons, but there is, again, and I'll try and explain it briefly, there is no proof that there is any virus, any viral infections, and nothing that is actually sexually, there is no such thing as a sexually transmitted disease at all. And it doesn't matter whether you say it's HIV or herpes or syphilis or anything else. And we've looked at all of those, and not once can you find that either a bacteria or a virus is involved. There are other reasons for it, and it starts to come into the particularly, well, let's take herpes for instance. Blisters appearing in the genital regions of people, which doctors go, oh, you've got herpes, sexually transmitted disease. Now, we looked at that very closely because we get asked the question a lot. And again, there's no viral cause of it. There's no bacterial cause of it. But it's a body's elimination process. So it's eliminating something, and the body can eliminate toxins through any areas on the body. Well, what happens is the medical establishment, depending on where the area of elimination is, they put a different name on it. So it might be, if you had the eruptions on the trunk of your body, they might say it was measles or chickenpox or something like that. But if you get it, or if you had these blisters around the waist, they may say it's, I'm trying to think of the name of it.
Shingles?
Shingles, that's it. They'll say it's shingles. And if you get them in the genital area, then it's a sexually transmitted disease. But in all cases, it's the body eliminating toxins through the skin, which is the body's largest organ for elimination. And it just comes out in different areas. And it's nothing to do with some sexually transmitted disease. Now, again, the reasons it might come out in the genital area, these toxins, is it can be a pretty warm and sweaty area, the genital areas. So the body sweats, and the sweating is a way that the body gets rid of toxins. So that's a nice, warm, sweaty area, maybe. And so that's where it comes out, And just because it comes out there, it doesn't mean that you've contracted some sexually transmitted disease. Another reason why it might be blisters and rashes in those areas might be because of the contraceptives that are being used. The male contraceptive, condom, is made of latex, which is actually an irritant. and the spermicides that are used either by the man or the woman are irritants to quite tender areas, the genital areas. Again, may cause rashes. Again, nothing to do with some germ or other, it's just chemical contamination.
Another chemical contamination with personal care products. I mean, people use all kinds of products to keep themselves, clean and fresh smelling. But a lot of them, if they've got what are called sort of perfume products or fragrances, I mean, they're highly toxic chemicals as well. And so it's not, that's another reason that, again, with warmth, the chemicals can irritate the skin and then produce eruptions in those areas. So, there are lots of possible causes, and we're not saying it's anyone. It could be all sorts of combinations of all of them, but it's nothing to do with the actual sexual act itself. Although one of the things,
nothing to do with the germ.
But sometimes they occur after sexual intercourse, and that's possibly because people can get kind of hot and sweaty, whatever, and so that can initiate some kind of body detoxification that happens soon afterwards. So it's all sorts of combinations, but it's nothing actually to do with a germ or anything to do with something that is transferred from one partner to another.
And that was very clear with the HIV thing. Nothing to do with either homosexual men having sex or heterosexual people having sex and transmitting this disease. It's complete fallacy and no science behind it. We have written an article which is on our website, which you might like to read, that says there's no such thing as a sexually transmitted disease. So, you're welcome to have a read at that. And we've researched the papers ourselves. We've gone back and looked at, I'm trying to think of the guy's name, Fry, is it?
T.C. Fry.
T.C.
Yes,
Fry.
yes.
He wrote quite extensively on that.
And Herbert Shelton wrote about syphilis. So there's quite an extensive discussion about syphilis actually in the book, because that is certainly nothing to do with sort of sexual intercourse either. I mean, that's made quite clear in that, but that's again, we looked into the research and discovered that that there's absolutely no basis for it to be claimed to be caused by any kind of virus or transmitted.
Can you lay out first what you found that proves that AIDS was not sexually transmitted?
Sorry, say that first bit again.
Can you just lay out for us what you found that helps show people that AIDS is not sexually transmitted?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's never been a virus isolated in the ways that we've said, the basic things that you need to go through: isolate, purify, categorize, and prove that it causes it. That's never been done right up to this day. And there are no scientific papers to show that it's been done. Kary Mullis, as well as us and many others, have looked for those papers. They don't exist because it's never been done. So, one, it's never been proved that a virus is the cause of it, but the toxic reasons that we talked about earlier, of the high use of amyl nitrate and high dose antibiotics, and then high dose medications, particularly AZT by the medical profession, all of those combinations of extremely toxic substances given to these poor guys, or anyone for that matter, those are the reasons that people really continue to get ill and eventually die. Those are the reasons. We always try to get people to go back to basics and say, look, if you're going to say that people have got this disease or that disease, go back to basics and look for, as we've done, has the germ which is being attributed to the disease ever been proved to cause that disease, whether it's bacterial or virological? Do the papers exist? Which they should. They should exist if it's been proven. And in every case, those papers do not exist. Now, as we've often said, if some doctor / scientist discovers a new bacterial cause or a new viral cause of a disease, he wants to write it up. He wants to have those papers published because it makes him, his name goes up in lights in medical history. He gets more money and grants, gets to run his own department. Big business, so big prestige. So it's not because doctors are shy and that they've discovered these things but don't really want to talk about it. They'd want to talk about it, because it's big money. So the fact that these papers don't exist anywhere, and lots of people have looked for them, including such luminaries as Kary Mullis, a real scientist, and they're not there. They're not there. So that's the first big warning bell. If those papers are not there, that's because it's not been proven. And if it's not been proven, you can't attribute a particular disease to it. And that's true for every single case. And that's the bottom line.
Sorry, go on.
No, you go on.
No, I was going to say, and that takes care of the idea that it's sexually transmitted, because that's not been proven either. So, yes.
And then on the contrary, there's there's studies with thousands of people with partners, right? Showing one partner being positive and the other partner not being positive. Correct?
Yes. Is it Nancy
Exactly.
Padian? Nancy Padian, is it? I think that's her. Yes.
There's
that
lots of
wasn't what she
cases.
was trying to prove, but the study that she conducted showed that there was no sort of what they call seroconversion. That the partner who was negative ended up becoming positive. So yes, there's quite a lot of that.
And because of
evidence
that, this is how sort of sneaky and dishonest the medical establishment is, because more and more cases were being shown that partners long-term partners, both men and women, where one partner was supposed to be HIV positive, according to the medical establishment, and yet these partners had lived together for many years and had normal sexual relationships, and the other partner had never supposedly become HIV positive. And because knowledge was becoming more and more widespread that this was the case, the medical establishment have come up with something to get themselves off the hook. And they now give a pill, which you're supposed to, if you're HIV positive, you take this pill every day, and it prevents you from infecting your partner or anyone else. So this was something new over the last few years, and they've done it to cover their arses, basically, so that you get lots of people now who are HIV positive. They go, well, I take this pill, which they have to pay for, of course, or they get it under Medicare or whatever, so that now that's why I'm not infecting anyone. I'm quite safe. I can't infect you because I'm taking this pill. And it's just another complete
They're told
lie.
they're HIV positive, but
Yeah.
it's absolutely meaningless, in the same way that the COVID test is meaningless.
And so this is what the medical establishment says now, that partners live together without infecting one another because they take our pill, which prevents them passing it on.
And then you get the latency. Apparently these so-called viruses are supposed to be latent, but of course they're not alive in the first place. So latency doesn't matter, because they can never be activated because they're not alive. So, it's all this terminology. There was a time when there was a definition of a virus, and it was quite clear that it was a non-living particle. And as time has gone on, the definition of the word virus, the idea behind this particle, is that it's sort of maybe partly somewhere in the grey area of it's sort of maybe partly alive, maybe, and now it's moved in much closer into being, it's alive, it's living. All the reports make out as if this particle is alive. And so many people believe it's an organism. It's not an organism. It isn't alive. It's just a particle of
it's of
genetic
cellular debris.
It's
That's
a particle of genetic material in a protein coat, and it's a piece of cellular debris. It was alive when it was part of a cell, but it was only the cell that was alive. Once the cell dies, breaks up into different parts, it's like, sort of dead skin.
It's the pane of glass that I mentioned, Imagine the pane of glass
wasn't
alive.
but
you break it up into pieces, and it's no longer a pane of glass, You break a cell up into pieces, it's no longer a cell. They're just bits of debris or bits of glass, and that's what it is. And this fudging of it that the establishment tries to do all the time, like with the pill, HIV pill prevention, or this, trying to make out that somehow these cellular particles, which do not meet under the standards of science, and we'll just mention them, do not meet under the standards of science a living entity. And now somehow, again, they're trying to fudge it and ignore that. I mean, for something to be categorized as alive, it has to be able to eat, excrete, reproduce, and have a certain minimum DNA. Those are the scientific classifications for something to be alive. These viral particles don't meet any of that criteria. So for them to try and now fudge it and say somehow these things are alive is just nonsense. And it just shows the disgraceful state that so-called science has lapsed into. And I have no kind words to say about them without using expletives. So be aware that what comes out of the mainstream media or the medical establishment, take a big stick and poke it away, because they're not going to tell you anything truthful. So it took us 10 years to find that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally shocking. I mean, it's totally shocking.
It is.
But, you know, I've found in my life that, you know, when I take the ideas that you're talking about, which is, don't just swallow the virus idea and the medication that comes with it, you know, so fast, but think deeply about my surroundings as to why I might be ill. You know, upon reflection, every single time, I can find what seems to be a more realistic source of that illness, and deal with it, you know, and not, you know, whether it's, and it's happened many times in my wife and I's life, whether it's, you know, mold or toxins that have been in our home, or you know, chlorine, spending too much time in an indoor water park. You know, all of these things there's here they are. There's good, legitimate reasons for why you might be ill that have nothing to do with it. I mean, nothing to do with the virus. It's not to speechify, but you know, it's like if I wake up, you know, too early, I haven't slept enough, I have a cold. Did I suddenly catch a cold? Do they only fly at 4:30 in the morning and you know, zip up no, I didn't get enough sleep. That's why I have a cold. It had nothing to do.
There's an interesting thing about sleep, because we looked into that, because you know, there's quite a lot of statistics that shows that, say, night shift workers have more illnesses and a shorter life expectancy than daytime workers. And you know, this, you can look into this. We did. And cutting a long story short, when the body goes to sleep, it expects to go to sleep in hours of darkness, and it starts to produce melatonin, which is like a clearing agent of the body. So it's
antioxidant.
It's an antioxidant, yeah. So it starts to clear out what are called free radicals. You know, these are all natural processes in the body. So the melatonin clears out the free radicals, which occur during normal daytime activity, and it's all part of the body healing. So if you then take that person out of those normal sleep rhythms and try to get them to sleep during hours of light and work during hours of darkness, the body is not going to function properly, because the melatonin doesn't get switched on during hours of daylight, because it's from a gland in the head, so it can tell whether it's night or dark. So that person, you know, you can start to see why that person will not be detoxifying, not be clearing out the free radicals, not producing the melatonin in the normal cycles that a normal natural body would in a normal lifestyle, because night shift working and working at night and sleeping in the day is not natural for the human body. And so that's why those people have more bouts of illness and shorter life expectancies. I'm only giving you a thumbnail sketch there, but there's quite a lot of research gone into that. And that's purely why sleep is so important. And to be able to sleep during hours of darkness. These are the natural patterns for life, and for your body to do what it does. So it's going through these very important healing processes while you sleep. And if you disrupt that, you're going to cause problems, which might come out as like cold symptoms or headaches or feeling sick or whatever.
So you're saying that so just sort of lay out, why would it come out as a cold symptom again? What's the melatonin does what exactly?
It's an antioxidant. I mean, you get antioxidants from your food, natural food, green leafy fruit and vegetables, basically, and from melatonin, which is produced by the body. So you get in antioxidants from stuff that you eat, and you get in antioxidants from the melatonin. And together, providing you've got the right levels of it, that's why nutritious food is important, and sleep is important. The body can clean up these free radicals, which get produced when the body's under stress and under normal working conditions. It produces these free radicals, which, if they're not cleared up, or can be destructive. They're like, in electrical terms, they're ions, so they will attack and they can be damaging to cells. But the body can take care of that providing it's got the correct level of nutrition and sleeping in the right cycles. But if those free radicals build up in the body, they start to damage cells on a greater level and can cause not only damage at cellular level, but also at organ level. So you can get more serious illnesses. So providing the natural processes of the body are adhered to, then the body's fine and its maintenance system works fine. So you have to give it the right level of nutrients from good food and proper sleeping patterns, minimize the amount of toxic intake, so being careful what you put in and on your body, and eliminate as much as possible your exposure to EMFs. I mean, you can't eliminate it completely, but it's just to be aware and take steps to minimize it. And we're back to our 4 factors again. And providing you maintain those 4 factors, all which don't actually cost you any money, you have to buy food anyway, it's just looking after yourself so that your body can look after you. Your body is very capable of doing these things. It's a self-regulating organism. And providing you just look after those 4 factors as best you can, you'll be healthy. You won't have colds and flu, you won't be ill, and you'll live a long and happy life.
Well, except that you don't have colds and flu. They're just sets of symptoms.
Those are just symptoms of your body trying to go, I've got to get rid of some crap, and this is what's happening, and that's just one of the symptoms.
Yeah, it's amazing. Did you find in your research that there have been doctors? It seems like you found in your research that there have been over the years doctors and scientists who have spoken out against germ theory. Is that true? Is it?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about who they've been over the time?
Well, again, we mentioned their names in the book, but I've got a terrible memory for names, so Dawn might remember them, but they're all in there.
Yes, one of them is Walter Hadwin, who I believe who's probably better known for being against vivisection, which we also talk about as well in the book. He was, I think, close to the same time as Pasteur. I don't know if they were exact contemporaries, but he was certainly around and active during the latter part of the 19th century. And he was particularly outspoken against not just the germ theory, but particularly vaccination. But again, because it's all related to vivisection, because the experiments they were doing were, on animals. And we
Henry Wheeler.
No, sorry, I was thinking there was another doctor. I don't know what the M stands for, but anyway, Dr. Beddoe Bailey in the early 20th century was also not only very much speaking out against vaccination. He also said that there is no evidence that any germ is the cause of any disease. There is no microorganism. So we cite a few of them, where we can. I mean, there were more, but obviously it's a question of choosing which ones
Well,
we actually did
if you want to write
discuss.
down another couple of names, there's Dr. Henry Beeler and there's T.C. Fry. You can look at the works.
He's
that
not a doctor.
no, but
But
he's there's also Harold Hillman, who was a cell biologist. There's a number of them that we do mention in there through the ages, and then right up to, of course, present day, where you've got our friend and Andrew Kaufman, Tom Cowan, and of course Dr. Stefan Lanka. You know, so all of these people and more have spoken out at one time or another to refute the germ theory and the fact that bacteria and viruses make people ill.
But also with vaccination, there was a very eminent doctor, Charles Crichton, who believed in vaccination. He was asked to write the entry, I can't remember exactly what year, but the late 19th century, he was asked to write the entry for Encyclopedia Britannica for vaccination. And instead of just, as he said, writing the standard explanation within it, he decided to go back and actually have a look at it and look for himself. And he discovered, to his amazement, horror, whatever, that there was no scientific evidence behind the practice of vaccination, and he called it a superstition. He did write the entry for that particular year for vaccination, but he shocked his contemporaries, and because he was honest about what he found about vaccination, that there was no basis and it was a superstition. It was based on superstition. And as I say, he was an eminent physician of the time. Obviously, that's why he was asked to write the entry for Encyclopedia Britannica. But he certainly made it quite clear. He went back, had a look and said, no, it's not based on evidence. Now, when you get somebody of that caliber, you think, no, there's definitely something wrong here. I mean, there are lots of documents written at the time by various scientists calling out the vaccination idea as a superstition, based on superstition, no basis in science whatsoever.
I mean,
we kept it to just a few, but that chapter alone we could have written an entire book about.
I mean, there's also a retired doctor now who's quite famous, Dr. Vernon Coleman, and he's very outspoken against vaccination. In fact, he has a book out called, it's quite a long title, it's called "Anyone That Says That Vaccinations Are Safe and Effective Is Lying." That's the title of his book. And he's a doctor. So there's lots of them, lots of doctors, but of course you don't get them in the mainstream media. But these are qualified people and researchers, and we do quote some of them and talk about some of their work in our book, and they're referenced at the back, so you can check out. There's some good books, like a book called The Poisoned Needle,
yes,
which is well worth. Lots of people that have really looked into it, doctors that have looked into it and have been very scathing about vaccinations. The whole thing is, as Dawn has said, the scientists who've said it's just a superstition that's not based on science, and it's a filthy thing to do. It's disgusting to inject toxic materials into people's bloodstreams. It's disgusting, and that's the best word for
it. Let's play a game before I let you guys go, and I don't know if DJ's got any questions. I'll name a disease, and you tell me if a virus caused it. AIDS.
No.
No.
The Spanish flu.
No.
No.
Smallpox.
No.
Cancer.
No.
No.
The regular flu.
No.
No.
Influenza of any kind.
I mean, you can mention measles.
No.
But definitely not. And there was a good court case. Stefan Lanka was in Germany, took it to court and proved in court that a virus does not cause measles. So there's an actual court case proving that a virus doesn't cause measles. So why doesn't everyone know about it? Why are they still vaccinating children against measles? Shows how corrupt the system is.
What do you think measles what do you think has actually caused, say, measles today, besides the measles vaccine?
Well, besides the measles vaccine, yes. Well, all the other vaccines as well. Well, again, it depends on diet. I mean, if children are fed sort of a lot of processed foods, a lot of highly sugared foods and drinks, again, calling it measles, it's not a particular specific disease. I mean, any of these sort of eruptive diseases, you know, things that are cause, you know, that cause eruptions, boils, spots, rashes, whatever on the skin. It's the skin eliminating toxins. So who knows? It's related. It could be related to the diet. Quite likely, other vaccines. Other medicines, yes, if they've got a fever, given medicines, you know, Tylenol, paracetamol.
People often say to us about their children going to measles parties, you know, so that if their children can get the measles at an early age, that'll mean they won't get it later on when it's more serious. This is a favourite one. And they say, well, you know, if it's not an infectious disease, how come my little Johnny went to this party and several people had got the measles and he got it as well? So therefore, case proven. And we say, well, no, that doesn't prove anything. First of all, go back to basics. You know, there's no virus been proved to cause it. We have a court case in Germany says it definitely is not caused by a virus. And say, well, okay, then what is it? So, well, there can be lots of reasons, some of which Dawn's just given. You know, kids go to a party and they're eating a lot of, generally at parties, there's jellies and cakes and all sorts of sugary treats, you know, basically a lot of toxic material. And they're eating this and enjoying it, having a great old time. And the body's going, this is crap. I want it out of my system. And they may come up, they may be sick, they may get diarrhea, they may have spots coming up on them. And then it gets diagnosed as measles. But another thing which people often forget about, and that's why it often gets called childhood illnesses, is that children of a certain age get vaccinated, you know, unless their parents are wise enough to go, you're not sticking that needle in my child, you know, or they know enough about it. So the majority of children, right from almost the day they're born, start getting loaded up with vaccinations, loaded up with toxic materials. So children of a certain age will start to detoxify around the same age. And so, you know, it might be a group of 7-year-olds or 10-year-olds or whatever it is, all who've been getting their vaccination shot, shall we say, around a certain time, and then start detoxifying those toxins and start coming up with rashes and spots and things around the same time. And then it's called a childhood illness, but it's not. They're detoxifying from all the crap that the medical establishment's pumped into them over the preceding years. And people often forget about that. And we often say to people, well, we would need to know what their vaccination regime has been, what they've had, what over-the-counter medications have they been giving, what sort of food do you feed them, what's their water supply like, what do they drink, you know, what's their environment. All of these factors are going to be what keeps a person either well or makes them ill. So, you know, because there's no one thing. But the one thing we are always sure of, because it's never been proved, it's not a germ of any sort. There is some other reason, always. And that's the short of it.
DJ?
Yeah, just since you've been talking about radiation, I just want to just check in. What do you think about the recent increase in radiation on the planet? Is that any?
Are we talking about electromagnetic radiation?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, it's harmful is the short answer. And the more you can shield yourself from it, the better. Very, very difficult now and getting increasingly difficult. It is detrimental to the body. We do explain it. You know, people have to remember that the body is an electrical system as well as a chemical system. And so it's got a very delicate and profound electrical system. You know, the blood circulation, the brain operation, lots of things depend on this very subtle and powerful electrical system at very, very tiny voltages and currents. So it stands to reason if you then subject that body to fairly high-powered electromagnetic fields, it's going to disrupt the very sensitive and delicate electromagnetic fields in the body. You know, I often say to people, it's a bit like if you've ever heard someone holding an electric drill near to your portable radio, and you get it to all sorts of squeals and crackles and disruptions. And that's the electrical interference affecting your radio signal. Well, the body works similarly. You keep bombarding it with these very strong electrical energies, you're going to disrupt this body's system, and all sorts of things are going to go wrong. So yeah, the more we get bombarded with these things and the more powerful they are, and this can be not only cell phones and cell towers, but radar stations. If you live near military establishments or airports, they have very powerful radar installations which are beaming out very powerful energy. We've seen lots of cases where it's sort of defoliated whole sheaths of forest where they're near and in the beam of a radar station. It's killing the trees. But then they'll try and pass that off as acid rain or climate change, rather than, no, it's the bloody military down the road that's killing your forest. It's well established, these facts, but not something the mainstream media is going to tell you because they're bought and paid for. Okay. I hope that's helped a bit anyway.
That helps. That definitely helps.
Yeah, God, that just reminds me of this Jim West. A look at why only baseball pitchers seem to get brain cancer. That baseball pitchers seem to get brain cancer at a much higher rate than other baseball players. And finally realized that there's a little ray gun that the umpire holds that tests the speed of the baseball. And he's sitting there pointing it at the head, the brain of the pitcher all game. And there was one other player on the baseball team that seems to get a high rate of brain cancer, and that's the catcher, because he's shooting it right through the catcher's head, boom, right into the pitcher's head.
Amazing. I've not heard that.
No, but I mean, yes,
Makes sense, though.
Well, that's an American sport, isn't it? But yeah, absolutely. But there you are. That's an explanation.
Yeah, radiation poisoning.
Yes, he does some amazing research. Yes.
Yeah. There's so many. I mean, thank God there's this like small community of people such as yourselves who have done this fantastic research. I mean, it's probably it's like, it always reminds me of the community at the end of Fahrenheit 451. It's like the small community of people who have decided to memorize books, and sort of carry on that there's an actual humanistic tradition, of caring about the truth and caring about each other, and that has sort of historically always, not always, but so often stood in opposition to the momentum of large society,
Well, I often say to people, if you look back in history, which is something we do and something that's a particular interest of ours anyway, all of the greatest crimes in history have been committed by governments. If you look, all of the greatest crimes in history have been committed by governments. So that should tell you something, shouldn't it? So we have to change the system, It doesn't have to be violent insurrection, but we have to change the system because it's not serving us well, is it? And it never has. So, and it's getting worse. So we're living through quite dire times at the moment. So that's why Dawn and I do what we do, and I'm sure why you do what you do. We're trying to get the information out there to people to make a change, because if we don't change it now, these people that are in charge are going to keep tightening the screw more and more and more. There's no end to it, because they want total control of the world and all the people in it. And it's as simple as that. And they'll stop at nothing to do it. I know that may sound all a little bit scary stuff, but unfortunately it's a fact of life, because it's, again, something else we've looked into, and I'm sure you have too. And it's very real. And we can see it now, because we can see that what they're doing with these ridiculous lockdown measures is not based on any science. So you have to ask the question, well, why are they doing it? They can't all be so stupid that they don't know there is no science to back this up. Well, of course, they're not all that stupid. Many of them in the lower echelons are, but right at the top, they know very well what they're doing, and they're getting away with it. are all based on this huge lie. And if we don't stop them, the end is for humanity is not very good. We'll be more and more enslaved by these reprehensible people.
That's why it's got to be stopped.
It has to be stopped. And we're trying to do our bit to do it, which is in a peaceful way, but it's we've decided to take education, if you like, as our method of making the changes. It's difficult, but it's the only way we can do it, for us anyway. Okay.
And thank you for it, and thank you so much for your hard work. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Oh, yes.
You guys are
Okay.
good. You guys
We hope you'll go away and tell everyone else.
we will.
Wake them up.
Oh yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. Hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Oh,
Yes, love to. Yeah.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to know what you how you develop this project into, what you develop it into, and see it at some stage. So yeah, it'd be lovely.
And if, I know we've talked an awful lot, me in particular, but if there are other aspects, obviously it's a big book, there's lots of aspects in it. If there are any particular parts that you'd like us to elaborate on at some later date that might help in whatever you're doing, we'd be more than happy to do that. Yeah.
Well, we may call. I'd love to have a longer conversation at some point about just the history of Rockefeller medicine and how it, what the sociology is there, the sociology of these whole research paradigms and people, doing this research with such blinders on. I think that's a great topic to sort of unpack and think about. So yeah, hopefully I know, and along with 50 other things that we could talk about. So yeah. Great.
Okay.
No, we'd be more than happy to. It'd be great.
Well, thank you for your time and your patience. And we'd love to talk again at some time in the near future.
All right. Well, have a great night, guys.
We will.
Thank you.
David.
Thank you.
Okay. See ya.
Bye for now,
Bye.
both. Bye for now.